Before I get into this one, if you're new here, welcome. And if this is not your first time watching, you already know what this channel is about. This is a story about someone who spent years working in one of the most remote parts of this country, told mostly in their own words. If a story like this one keeps you up a little later than you planned, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like on the video, and tell me in the comments if you have ever felt like something in the woods was paying closer attention to you than it should have been. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know, and I read every comment. All right, let's get into it. My name doesn't matter for this one, but my job does. I worked 5 seasons as a backcountry ranger in Denali National Park and Preserve, mostly out of the Western District, which most visitors never see because the road only goes so far and everything past that point is foot travel, bush plain, or nothing at all. 6 million acres, one road, and once you're off it, the wilderness does not care how experienced you are. I want to say that up front because what I'm about to describe did not happen to someone careless. It happened to me and to 2 other rangers I trust completely, in a place that has a name on the park's internal maps and a very different kind of reputation among the small handful of people who actually go there. There is a patrol cabin at approximately mile 40 of the old mining route that runs along a drainage we call Sable Creek internally, though that's not its real name either, because none of us who know the place like using its actual designation out loud. The cabin was built in the 1930s by a trapper who worked the area before it became parkland, and it was later adopted by the Park Service as an emergency patrol shelter, the kind of structure you find every 20 or 30 miles across the interior, stocked with basic supplies, a wood stove, a logbook, meant to keep a stranded ranger or researcher alive through a bad storm. Every patrol cabin in the park has a logbook. It's tradition and it's practical. Whoever stays there writes the date, conditions, wildlife sightings, anything relevant for the next person who might need the information. Reading old logbooks is one of the small pleasures of the job, honestly. You get decades of handwriting, decades of small human moments. Someone noting a caribou herd crossing at dawn, someone complaining about a leaky roof, someone just writing that they made it through a whiteout and were grateful to be alive. The Mile 40 cabin's logbook is different, and I did not understand how different until my second winter on staff. I want to explain the assignment first, because context matters. Denali runs a winter caretaker program, a skeleton crew of rangers who rotate through remote patrol cabins during the coldest months, mostly to maintain a Park Service presence, check on wildlife corridors, and be available in the extremely rare case that someone needs rescue during the off-season. Though realistically, almost nobody is out there in January. It is solitary work. You are typically alone in a cabin for stretches of 1 to 2 weeks, resupplied by ski plane when weather allows, and otherwise completely on your own with a radio, a wood stove, and whatever supplies you packed in. I drew the Mile 40 rotation in my second winter, 2 weeks in late January, temperatures running consistently below -20, which is normal for that time of year and that far into the interior. I had done winter caretaker rotations before at 2 other cabins without incident, so I was not nervous going in. If anything, I was looking forward to it. There's a particular kind of peace in that kind of isolation once you get used to it, a silence so total it becomes almost restful. The cabin itself was exactly what I expected from the file photos. Single room, wood stove, a sleeping loft, a table, shelving stocked with emergency rations, and the logbook sitting in a waterproof case on the table, the way it always does. I settled in the first evening, got the stove going, made dinner, and before bed, I did what every caretaker does. I opened the logbook to log my arrival and read through the previous entries to catch up on recent conditions. The most recent entry before mine was from 3 weeks earlier, another ranger named Owen Castellano finishing his own rotation. His entry was normal. Weather notes, a caribou sighting, a comment about needing to rechink one of the wall logs before next winter. Standard stuff. I logged my own arrival below his and went to sleep. I want to describe the radio schedule because it matters to what happened next. Winter caretakers check in with dispatch at the main district office twice daily, morning and evening, on a fixed schedule, using a satellite radio that is the cabin's only reliable communication with anyone. It is not optional. If you miss 2 consecutive scheduled check-ins, dispatch initiates a welfare check, which in winter conditions can take a day or more to actually reach you, depending on weather and aircraft availability. Everyone takes the schedule seriously for that reason alone. On my 4th night at the cabin, I did my evening check-in on schedule, reported normal conditions, nothing unusual, and went to bed around 10. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of the cabin's outer door latch moving. Not the wind. The specific mechanical sound of the actual latch being lifted from outside. I want to be precise that this is an interior cabin latch, the kind you lift with your thumb, and it is loud enough and distinct enough that there is no mistaking it for wind or a settling structure. I had bolted the interior deadbolt before bed, as every caretaker is trained to do, both for bear safety in warmer months and simply out of habit that carries into winter even though bears are denayed up by January. The latch lifted twice, paused, lifted a 3rd time, and then stopped. I lay still in the loft for what felt like a long time, maybe 10 minutes, listening. No footsteps in the snow outside that I could hear, though the wind was up enough that night that footsteps might have been masked. No further sound at the door. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a wind gust catching the latch mechanism in some way I didn't fully understand. I went back to sleep, uneasy but not alarmed enough to break radio silence over it. In the morning, I checked the door and the latch mechanism carefully. It was in good working order, no obvious way for wind alone to lift it from outside 3 separate times with a pause between each attempt. I looked at the snow around the cabin's single small window and around the door. There were no footprints, not partial prints, not old prints filled in by drifting snow. Nothing. Given the wind overnight, fresh snow could plausibly have covered light tracks, so I did not read too much into the absence of prints at the time. I logged the incident factually in the logbook that morning, the same way I would log any anomaly, date, time, description, no speculation, because that is what the logbook is for. That evening, out of curiosity more than anything, I went back through the older entries in the logbook, further back than I had bothered to read on my first night. I was looking for whether anyone else had ever logged something similar. What I found instead was stranger than a matching entry would have been. There is a section of the logbook, roughly a dozen entries spread across almost 40 years, going back as far as the 1980s, where different caretakers in different years, using visibly different handwriting, ink, and even different logbook volumes as the books were replaced over the decades, each independently described the exact same thing. The door latch lifting at night, always after midnight, always with a pause between attempts, always with no tracks in the snow afterward. Some entries were brief and factual like mine. A few were longer. One from 1994, written by a caretaker whose name I will not use here out of respect for privacy, described staying awake for the rest of that night with a flashlight trained on the door, and wrote that the latch lifted a 4th time while she was watching it directly, with her hand nearly on the deadbolt, and that nothing pushed against the door afterward, no weight against the wood, nothing, as if whatever was lifting the latch had no interest in actually opening the door once. She was awake and aware of it. I sat with that entry for a long time that second evening. I remember the stove ticking as it cooled and thinking about how many different people, spread across 4 decades, none of whom could plausibly have coordinated a joke or a shared delusion, had all described the identical detail of a pause between latch attempts. That specific rhythm, lift, pause, lift, is not something you'd expect 2 unrelated people to invent independently if they were simply spooked by wind and imagining things. It is too oddly specific, too consistent. The following 2 nights were uneventful. I began to relax slightly, telling myself the incident was a one-time thing, that I had simply gotten the unlucky rotation where the wind did something unusual to an old latch mechanism, and that the historical entries were probably some combination of coincidence and cabin folklore feeding on itself over the years, each new caretaker half expecting it and half imagining what they'd been told to expect. On my seventh night, the latch lifted again, 3 times with pauses exactly as before. This time I was awake before it started, unable to sleep, reading by headlamp in the loft. I heard it clearly from the beginning. I did not go down to the door. I stayed in the loft with my headlamp off, listening, and after the third lift and pause, I heard something I had not heard the first time. A single word, spoken very quietly, close to the door, in a voice too muffled by the thick log wall to identify as male or female, young or old. I cannot make out the word with certainty. It sounded like it might have been a name, though not mine and not any name I recognized. It could equally have been wind distortion working on some other sound entirely, and I want to be honest that I cannot rule that out. But it did not feel like wind to me in the moment, and I have not been able to talk myself into that explanation since, no matter how many times I've tried. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I did my scheduled check-in, and against the instinct that had kept me quiet the first time, I reported the incident to dispatch, factually the same way I had logged it. The ranger on duty that morning, a longtime dispatcher named Patricia, on who has worked in that district office for almost 20 years, was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then asked me, without any surprise in her voice, whether it had happened 3 times with pauses. I said yes. She said that was consistent with what she'd heard before, and that mile 40 had something of a quiet reputation among the caretaker program, never formally documented anywhere beyond the logbook itself, never treated as an official hazard, but well known enough among the small pool of rangers who rotate through it that most caretakers, by the time they finish their first stay there, have heard at least secondhand that the door does that sometimes. I finished my rotation without further incident and was relieved by another ranger a week later. I told him what had happened, factually the way it had been told to me by nobody in particular before I arrived, and watched him take it the way I had, polite skepticism layered over something he wasn't quite willing to say out loud yet. I did one more winter rotation at mile 40 the following year, mostly because I did not want the incident to be the reason I avoided a piece of terrain I otherwise loved working in. Nothing happened that second time. No latch, no voice, 14 quiet nights, and a peaceful return to the road. I have wondered since whether it only happens to caretakers who are alone there for the first time, or whether it is simply unpredictable, or whether I got lucky the second time in a way I cannot explain any better than I can explain the first. Before I left the program for good, I made a point of talking to Owen Castellano, the ranger whose entry had been the last one in the logbook before mine that first winter, the one that read completely normal, no mention of anything unusual. I asked him directly whether he had experienced anything during his rotation. He was quiet for a moment, the same kind of quiet Patricia had been on the radio, and then he told me something he said he had never written down anywhere because he did not think anyone would believe a story that had left no evidence at all. He told me that on his last night at the cabin, he had woken to the sound of someone moving around inside the single room below the loft, footsteps on the wood floor, slow and deliberate, crossing from the door toward the stove and back again several times over the course of maybe 2 minutes. He said he had lain frozen in the loft, certain that if he looked over the edge he would see someone standing there, and equally certain that he did not want to know. Eventually the footsteps stopped. He waited a long time before working up the nerve to look down. The room was empty, the door still bolted from the inside exactly as he had left it. He checked the stove, the shelving, every corner of the small cabin. Nothing was disturbed. He said the strangest part was that the floorboards, which he knew from 2 weeks of living there, creaked loudly and unevenly under his own weight, had made no creaking sound at all under whatever had been walking across them that night. Only the flat, even sound of footsteps on wood, as if the person or thing making them weighed nothing at all. He never mentioned it in his logbook entry because, in his words, writing it down would have made it real in a way he wasn't ready for, and because he did not want the next caretaker reading his entry to walk and already afraid. I understood that instinct completely, because it was close to the reason I had almost stayed quiet about my own first night, and I imagine it is the same reason so many of the older entries I found were so brief and factual, stripped of the fear the caretakers must have actually felt while it was happening. Nobody wants to be the one who makes the cabin sound worse than it already is, even when every one of them privately believes it deserves the reputation. What has stayed with me longest is not the sound of the latch or the half-heard word through the wall, but the sheer consistency of it across so many years and so many different people who never met each other, never compared stories in real time, and had every reason to keep quiet rather than add another entry to a pattern they may not have even fully recognized as a pattern until they read back through the book the way I did. A forest, or in this case a stretch of frozen interior wilderness, can hold on to something for a very long time if enough people keep quietly stepping around it instead of confronting it directly. And I think that is exactly what has happened at Mile 40 for the better part of a century, ever since long before the Park Service ever put a logbook on that table. I no longer work in Denali, though I think about that cabin more than almost anywhere else. I worked across 5 seasons in the wilderness. If you ever find yourself reading a patrol cabin logbook anywhere in the backcountry, take the time to read all the way back through the old entries, not just the recent ones. Sometimes the most important information in that book is not the weather. The Widow Grove. I have been a backcountry ranger in Redwood National Park for 14 years. Before that, I spent 3 seasons with the Forest Service in the Trinity Alps and a winter doing avalanche work in the Sierra. I'm telling you this not to impress you, but so you understand something. I'm not a person who gets rattled easily. I have pulled 2 bodies out of Redwood Creek during flood season. I have sat with a hiker who broke his femur 11 miles from the nearest road and kept him talking for 6 hours until the helicopter could get through the fog. I know what fear feels like when it has a normal cause. This is not that. Most people who visit this park never leave the main corridor. They walk the Lady Bird Johnson Grove. They take photos next to trees older than the Roman Empire, and they go home happy, and rightly so, because that part of the park is genuinely one of the most beautiful places on Earth. But the park is over 130,000 acres, and most of it sees almost nobody. The interior groves along the upper reaches of Redwood Creek and its side drainages are some of the least visited old-growth forest left on the West Coast. There are sections back there that get maybe a dozen human visits a year, and half of those are us. I want to be precise about what I am about to describe because precision is the only thing that has kept me sane about it. This is not a ghost story. Nobody died there that I know of, at least not recently. Not that anyone reported. I'm not going to tell you a tree is haunted. I'm going to tell you what I saw, what I measured, and what 4 other people who have worked this district longer than me have independently confirmed, without ever comparing notes with each other beforehand. Then you could decide what to make of it. There is a grove off a side drainage we call Bear Creek internally, though that is not its name on any map, because giving a real name felt like giving it more attention than it deserved. It sits about 2.5 miles off the nearest maintained trail, up a drainage so choked with vine maple and down timber that you cannot make more than half a mile an hour through in summer, and you simply cannot get through it all for about 5 months of the year once the creek comes up. There is no trail to it. There has never been a trail to it. You get there by bushwhacking, and only 4 people currently on staff know the route well enough to find it without a GPS track, because a GPS track only tells you where to go, not how to physically move your body through that terrain without breaking an ankle. I found it by accident in my 2nd season on a fisheries survey with a biologist named Renata, who has since transferred to Yosemite. We were counting salmon reds in a tributary that does not have an official name, just a number on the hydrology maps. We came up out of the creek bottom to get around a log jam and ended up higher on the slope than we meant to be, in a stand of old growth that neither of us recognized from any map. The first thing I noticed was the light. Redwood canopy in general is dim. Everyone who has walked under old-growth redwoods knows that particular green twilight, even at midday. But this stand was darker than that, darker in a way that did not match the canopy density above us. I remember looking up and thinking the trees did not seem tall enough or thick enough overhead to account for how little light was reaching the ground. It felt like standing in a room with the wrong number of light bulbs for its eyes. The second thing I noticed was the quiet. Redwood forest floor is usually alive with small sound, even when it looks still. Banana slugs moving through duff, Steller's jays somewhere up in the canopy, the constant faint trickle of water finding its way downhill even in dry months because the fog drip never really stops back there. This grove had none of it. Renata noticed it before I said anything. She stopped walking and said, "Does it feel wrong in here to you?" And I said yes, and neither of us could explain what wrong meant. We did not linger. We had salmon to count, and we were already off our planned route. So we worked our way back down to the creek and finished the survey, and I honestly did not think much more about it that day. It was the kind of odd feeling you file away and forget. I brought it up that evening back at the station anyway, mostly as a funny aside, to a trail supervisor named Walt Bristow who has been with this park for over 25 years. I described where we had ended up, the strange quiet, the light that did not add up. Walt was eating dinner out of a plastic container, and he set his fork down slowly and asked me exactly where. I described it as best I could, the drainage, the logjam, the direction we had climbed. He asked if we had gone and passed a big double-leader redwood near the base of the slope, one with a burn scar shaped almost like an arrow pointing uphill. I said yes, actually, we had walked right past something like that. He nodded once and said, "That is the Widow Grove, and we don't go up there." I asked why we called it that. He said the older trail crews called it that decades before he started, and nobody living seemed to know the actual origin of the name anymore, only that it had always meant one thing to everyone who used it: stay out. I asked if there was an official closure on it, a hazard designation, anything in the district records. He said no. It has never been mapped, never been surveyed, never appeared in any resource management document, because as far as the park's official records are concerned, it does not exist. It is simply a piece of forest that 4 or 5 people over the decades have quietly agreed to avoid and to steer everyone else away from without ever writing down why. The same way you would avoid a specific tide pool because your grandmother told you not to swim there and you never questioned it enough to ask her the reason before she passed. That should have been the end of it for me. For almost 2 years, it mostly was. I stayed out of that drainage on purpose, which was not hard, since there was no professional reason to go up there and plenty of reason not to bushwhack through blackberry thickets and vine maple tangles for no operational purpose. But I am the kind of person who cannot leave a locked door alone, and eventually curiosity did what curiosity does. In my 4th season, on a slow October week with almost no visitors in the backcountry and clear weather forecast for 4 straight days, I told myself I was doing an unofficial hazard assessment. If there was something dangerous back there, unstable ground, a hidden sinkhole, an old mining shaft, it was arguably my job to know about it, even if nobody had ever asked me to look. I want to be honest that this reasoning was mostly an excuse. I want to see it again and understand what I'd felt. I went in alone, which I do not recommend to anyone, and would formally write up any ranger under my supervision for doing. I found the double-leader tree with the arrow-shaped burn scar without much trouble. My memory of it was better than I expected, and I climbed the slope the same way Renata and I had 2 years earlier. The grove looked exactly as I remembered it. Same unaccountable dimness. Same total absence of sound. The trees themselves, when I actually looked at them carefully this time, instead of just feeling uneasy, were unremarkable old growth coast redwoods, large but not unusually so for this part of the park, 6 to 9 feet in diameter, deeply furrowed reddish bark, healthy-looking crowns as far as I could see through the canopy gaps. Nothing about any individual tree looked wrong. It was the collective feeling of the place that was wrong, in a way I still cannot fully articulate. Something about how evenly the light was absorbed, how completely the forest floor swallowed footstep sound, how the temperature felt several degrees colder than the drainage I had just climbed out of despite no obvious source of cold air. I did what I do professionally. I started documenting. I took a compass bearing on the slope orientation, and it read normal for the terrain. I photographed several of the larger trees for size reference. I noted soil composition, which was unremarkable duff and mineral soil, nothing like the strange bright sphagnum some old-timers describe finding in isolated pockets elsewhere in the park. I checked my GPS, which acquired a signal without difficulty and placed me exactly where the terrain suggested I should be. No anomaly there at all, which for some reason unsettled me more than an anomaly would have. I wanted there to be an equipment failure I could point to. There was not one. I walked further into the grove than Renata and I had gone, maybe another 100 yards uphill, working my way between trunks, taking photographs every 20 or 30 feet as a kind of discipline, a way of forcing myself to keep behaving like a professional instead of whatever the alternative was. About that 100-yard mark, I came to a downed redwood, an old giant, long dead, decayed enough that its bark had mostly sloughed away, lying across the slope roughly perpendicular to my direction of travel. Notably, unlike every other downed redwood I have ever seen in this park, there were no hemlock or spruce seedlings growing along its length. Redwood forest floor nurse logs are almost always thick with new growth. That is one of the defining features of how this ecosystem regenerates itself. This log was bare, not recently bare either. It had clearly been down for decades based on its decay state, plenty of time for a healthy nurse log community to establish, and nothing had. I climbed over it, and on the far side the character of the grove changed slightly. The trees were more evenly spaced here, which I noted at the time without fully processing what that meant, because natural old growth redwood spacing is irregular, clustered around family groups sprouted from a common root system, gapped where past fires or blowdowns took out individuals. This spacing was closer to what you would see in a managed plantation, though the trees themselves were clearly ancient, easily 800 to 1,000 years old based on bark characteristics and diameter, which made the even spacing genuinely strange, because nobody was managing redwood plantations 1,000 years ago in a national park. I stopped there and made myself take stock of what I was doing. I had walked well past the point where I had any operational justification for being there. I was alone, off any known route, with no one aware of my specific location. Every instinct I have built over 14 years of backcountry work was telling me the same single thing. Not as fear exactly, more like the flat, wordless certainty you feel standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. Not now. Not further. I did not walk further. I want to be clear that nothing chased me, nothing spoke, nothing moved that I saw. I simply turned around, and as I did, I noticed something I had missed on the way in. Between two of the evenly spaced trunks, maybe 30 feet off my path, there was a section of ground where the duff and understory growth gave way to bare soil, roughly circular, 8 or 10 feet across. I did not walk over to examine it closely. I photographed it from where I stood, at maximum zoom, and I left. The photographs from that hike, when I looked at them back at the station, showed exactly what I remembered seeing, nothing more and nothing less, which somehow felt like its own small relief, though I could not have told you what I was afraid the camera might show instead. I told Walt what I had done. He was not angry, which surprised me. He just looked tired, and he told me a story I have not been able to fully shake since. In the late 1980s, before his time, but relayed to him by the crew leader who trained him, a young seasonal trail worker went up into that grove on his own initiative, much like I had, and came back describing a bare clearing with a worked stone at its center, flat-topped, deliberately placed in a section of forest that predates any documented human presence in that specific drainage by centuries. He went back a second time against direct instruction and came back different, according to the people who worked with him that season, quieter, unwilling to discuss what he had found the second time. And he left the park for good within a month and was never heard from by anyone at the station again. I never found a stone. I did not go far enough to find out whether there was one to find, and I have made my peace with never knowing, because the alternative, going back to look, is not something I'm willing to do. Walt was not the only one who talked to me about it that winter. A few weeks later, I brought it up with a wildlife biologist named Sofia Delgado, who had been running black bear population surveys in that district for almost a decade, using remote trail cameras staked out at intervals along the ridge lines above the main drainages. I asked her, half joking, whether she had ever set a camera anywhere near the Widow Grove. She did not laugh. She told me she had tried exactly once, in her second year on the job, before anyone had warned her off the area, because the terrain looked promising for bear activity, and she had not yet learned which parts of the map were unofficially off-limits. She set the camera on a young hemlock about 60 yards below, where I estimate the grove itself begins, aimed up the slope, motion-triggered, standard configuration she used everywhere else in the park with reliable results. She left it for the normal 6-week cycle. When she went back to retrieve it, every single frame on the memory card was blank. Not corrupted, not overexposed, not full of static. Blank, meaning the camera had recorded nothing happening in front of it for 6 full weeks in a forest that, everywhere else in the park, triggers dozens of images a week just from squirrels and deer and wind-moving branches. The battery had drained on schedule, meaning the camera had been actively cycling and attempting to record the entire time. It had simply captured nothing. She reviewed the footage twice, assuming a hardware fault, then swapped the camera for a different unit and repeated the placement the following season out of stubbornness. Same result. 6 weeks, thousands of trigger events logged internally by the camera's own activity counter, and not one usable frame. She pulled the camera permanently after that, and never mentioned it to anyone until I asked. I thought about that a great deal afterward, more than I thought about the stone or the even spacing of the cedars. Photographs I took inside the grove came out fine. My own memory of standing there is vivid and unbroken, but a machine left unattended at the threshold of the place, with no human nearby to account for, recorded nothing at all for 6 straight weeks. I do not have an explanation for that discrepancy, and I have stopped looking for one. The following spring, Maria Ochoa, the district's other year-round backcountry ranger, told me her own story, which she had apparently been sitting on for almost as long as Walt had been sitting on his. She had gone in only once, in her first season, before the informal rule had been explained to her clearly enough to take seriously. She did not walk nearly as far as I had. She said she stopped almost immediately after crossing the bare-floored nurse log, the same one I described climbing over, because she looked down at her boots and realized she could not hear them landing on the ground, even though she could feel the impact through her legs with every step. She described it exactly the way I would have, sound reaching her body, but not her ears, a disconnect between what her feet told her and what the air around her told her, and she said it was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to her in the backcountry, more frightening than the 2 river rescues and 1 mountain lion encounter she had also lived through over her career. She turned around within 100 feet and never went back. What strikes me most, turn it all over years later, is how little any of us actually needed to compare notes to arrive at the same conclusion. Walt, Camille, Kyle, Sophia, Maria, myself, none of us sat down together and built a shared story out of pieces. Each of us went in separately over a span of more than 2 decades, and each of us came back with our own fragment, our own private reason for never going back, and every fragment pointed the same direction without ever being assembled on purpose. That, more than anything I personally saw in that grove, is what convinces me there is something real back there worth staying away from. Coincidence explains one strange afternoon. It does not easily explain 5 people working the same district across different decades, independently deciding the same forest floor is not safe to stand on for very long. I still work this district. I still love this park, genuinely, the way you love a place that has given you your whole adult life. I patrol the maintained trails. I do my fishery surveys. I pull people out of the creek when the water rises too fast for them to judge safely. But there is a drainage 2.5 miles off any trail where 4 of us who know the way and have all separately, without ever fully explaining it to each other, decided the same thing. We do not go back, not because anyone told us not to, because something in that quiet, evenly spaced, sound-swallowing grove told us itself. The same wordless way you know not to step off a ledge in the dark, and some warnings, however irrational they sound written down afterward, are simply worth keeping. The Fire Watch Tower nobody staffs. I spent 6 seasons working fire prevention and backcountry patrol in the Yellowstone backcountry, most of it based out of a district office on the park's eastern edge, an area that get a fraction of the visitors the geyser basins and the main road corridor see every year. Most of my job was unglamorous. Checking permits, clearing down timber off horse trails, doing controlled burn prep work with a fire crew in the spring. But every ranger who works fire in that district eventually ends up with an opinion about Baldy Point. And mine took a long time to form because for most of my first 2 seasons I did everything I could to avoid forming one at all. Baldy Point is an old fire lookout tower, built in the 1930s like most of the standing towers still scattered across the park. 60 feet of wooden lattice topping out on a bald ridge with a clear sight line over 3 separate drainages, which made it valuable real estate for fire detection back before satellite monitoring and aerial patrol made most of the old towers obsolete. The park still staffs a handful of towers seasonally, mostly for tradition and backup detection capability, but Baldy Point has not had an official staff season since the early 2000s. Budget cuts took it offline along with several others, and it has sat empty ever since, structurally sound enough that it hasn't been torn down, but with no assigned lookout, no maintenance schedule beyond a basic annual safety inspection, and no reason for anyone to go up there except curiosity or a very specific kind of assignment. I got that assignment in my 3rd season, when the park's fire management office decided to do a structural condition survey of all the decommissioned towers still standing in the backcountry, partly to decide which ones were worth restoring for a planned volunteer lookout program, and which ones needed to finally come down. I drew Baldy Point along with 2 other towers in my district, mostly because I was the ranger who happened to be free that week, and the hike-in wasn't considered difficult, about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, with a straightforward, well-marked route most of the way. The lead on the survey was a facilities engineer named Grant Whitfield who had done similar work on towers across 3 other national forests before transferring into the park system. A careful, unromantic kind of guy who cared about load ratings and rod inspection and had absolutely no patience for backcountry folklore. I mention that because it matters later. We hiked in on a clear July morning, made good time, and reached the base of the tower by early afternoon. From a distance, it looked exactly like every other decommissioned lookout tower I'd seen. Weather gray wood, the small cab at the top with its wraparound windows catching the light, a steep exterior stairway zigzagging up the open lattice structure. Grant did his usual walk around the base first, checking the footings and the lower cross bracing, making notes on a clipboard, entirely businesslike. It was on that walk around the base that I noticed something odd about the ground directly beneath the tower's cab, 60 feet up. In a rough circle, maybe 20 feet across, centered under where the cab overhung the platform below it, the wildflowers and grass that grew everywhere else on that open ridge were noticeably stunted, thin, yellowish, clearly struggling compared to the healthy growth just a few feet outside that circle. I pointed it out to Grant. He crouched down, rubbed some of the soil between his fingers, and said it was probably runoff from old lead paint or preservative treatment flaking off the structure over decades, which is a real and fairly common phenomenon around old wooden towers, and it satisfied him completely. It did not fully satisfy me, but I filed it away and we started the climb. The stairway was solid, no structural concerns on the way up, though I noticed the wood felt colder to the touch than the ambient temperature seemed to justify for a clear July afternoon, cold enough that I actually commented on it to Grant, who didn't seem to notice anything unusual and chalked it up to the wood being shaded by the tower's own structure for most of the morning. The cab at the top was a single room, maybe 14 feet square, windows on all four sides, the way every historic lookout is built, designed to give a lookout an unobstructed view in every direction. Most decommissioned towers I'd been in before had that particular abandoned stillness, dust, a few old supplies left behind, sometimes graffiti from hikers who'd made the climb over the years despite the tower being technically closed to public access. Baldy Point had almost none of that. No dust accumulation on the windowsills to speak of, no graffiti, nothing left behind, as if it had simply been closed up and never touched again, which did not match the maintenance logs, which showed at least one annual inspection visit every single year since decommissioning. Grant went to work immediately, checking the roof seams, the window frames, the old built-in map table in the center of the room that lookouts historically used to triangulate smoke sightings using a device called an Osborne Firefinder, a rotating sighting instrument mounted on a topographic map. Baldy Point's Firefinder was still bolted to the table, an original piece of equipment, and out of professional habit, I walked over to look at it while Grant worked through a checklist. The Firefinder's sighting ring, a rotating metal band with crosshairs used to take a bearing on smoke, was pointed at a fixed heading, roughly northeast, toward a section of forest well within the district, but not toward any particularly notable landmark I could immediately place. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it had simply been left in whatever position the last active lookout used decades ago. I mentioned it to Grant anyway, and he glanced over and said something that stuck with me more than he probably intended. He said that was strange because standard closing protocol for these towers when they were decommissioned included resetting all instrumentation to a neutral home position, logged and signed off by the closing inspector, and that if a sighting ring was still pointed at an active bearing, someone had moved it since then, which shouldn't have been possible given how infrequently anyone came up here and how thoroughly locked the cab was supposed to be between inspections. We finished the structural survey without further incident. Grant satisfied that the tower was sound enough to be a strong candidate for restoration, and we began to hike back out that same afternoon, planning to camp partway down and finish the trail out the following morning. That night, camped about 3 miles below the tower along the same ridge system. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning to a sound I initially took for wind moving through the lodgepole pines around our camp, a low, steady tone that rose and fell in a pattern too regular to be ordinary wind. I lay awake listening to it for several minutes before I placed what it reminded me of, the specific whistling drone old fire towers sometimes produce when wind moves through the lattice structure and the open stairway at a particular angle, a sound I'd heard once or twice before at other active towers during storms. The problem was that the night was almost dead calm. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside to check, and the air was still enough that our camp's small fire hadn't so much as flickered in over an hour. There was no wind to produce that sound, and yet it continued, faint but unmistakable, carrying down the ridge from the direction of the tower for what felt like 10 or 15 minutes before it stopped as abruptly as it had started. I woke Grant to ask if he'd heard it. He had, and admitted it had woken him too, though he offered a more mundane theory, some kind of settling in the structure's old joints as temperatures dropped overnight, with contracting and producing sound through the lattice even without wind. It was a reasonable explanation, and I wanted to believe it. I still turned it over for the rest of that hike out, though, because the tone had a rise and fall to it, almost rhythmic, that simple thermal contraction doesn't typically produce. I did not think much more about Baldy Point for almost a year, until the fire management office assigned me to accompany a two-person volunteer lookout crew who had been selected for a pilot season staffing the tower again, the first active season it would have in over 15 years, following grant structural approval. My job was simply to hike the crew in, help them get settled, and do a routine check and visit 2 weeks later. The crew was a retired schoolteacher named Harriet Voss and her husband Dale, both experienced backcountry volunteers who had done lookout duty at other parks before and knew exactly what they were signing up for in terms of isolation. They were in good spirits on the hike in, genuinely excited about the assignment, and I remember thinking the tower's odd little details from the survey trip, the sound, the stunted grass, the move firefinder would probably turn out to be nothing once people were actually living and working up there again, the way old buildings often lose their strangeness once they're occupied and used the way they were built to be used. That is not quite what happened. When I did my 2-week check and hike, both Harriet and Dale were in good health and good spirits. No complaints about the work itself, which involved regular smoke watches and radio check-ins with the district office, standard lookout duty. But Harriet asked to speak with me privately while Dale was occupied with an equipment check, and told me that on 3 separate nights since they'd arrived, she had woken to find Dale standing at the north-facing window of the cab, completely still, apparently asleep on his feet, facing out toward the same northeast bearing the old firefinder had been pointed at when Grant and I found it. She said he had no memory of getting up on any of those nights, and that on the 3rd occasion she had gently guided him back to bed, and he had gone without resistance, still apparently unconscious, and slept normally afterward with no ill effects the following day. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she had taken to keeping the firefinder's sighting ring locked in its designated neutral position with a small padlock she'd brought for an unrelated purpose, because on 2 mornings early in their stay, she had found it rotated back to that same northeast heading despite neither of them touching it. And despite the cab door being locked from the inside, overnight the way lookout protocol requires. I'll log her report factually when I got back to the district office, the same way she'd have wanted it logged without embellishment. Before I left that check-in visit, I asked Harriet one more question, mostly because it had been bothering me since the survey trip the year before. I asked whether either of them had noticed anything strange about the tower's original records, the old logbooks and inspection files that predated the decommissioning in the early 2000s. She said she hadn't looked, but that Dale had, out of simple curiosity during a slow afternoon, and had found something in a box of archived paperwork stored in a metal trunk bolted to the cab's floor beneath the map table. Paperwork nobody on the survey team, including me and Grant, had noticed the year before because we'd been focused entirely on structural assessment. The trunk held decades of old logbooks going back to the tower's original construction, and Dale had paged through several of them, looking for anything about the firefinder or the strange sounds, mostly as an idle project to pass a quiet evening. He found nothing directly about either, but he did find something else that Harriet mentioned almost reluctantly, as if she wasn't sure it was relevant or wanted to overstate it. In the tower's earliest logbook from the 1930s, the original lookout, whose name was recorded simply as G. Renner with no first name given anywhere in the volume, had made a series of entries across one particular August that described repeatedly sighting smoke on a bearing to the northeast, the same bearing the firefinder was later found pointed at. despite there being no fire ever confirmed in that direction by ground crews sent to investigate. Renner's entries grew shorter and more clipped as that August went on, ending abruptly on the 29th with a single line noting smoke sighted again. Crew dispatched. Nothing found. Will not report further sightings on this bearing. There is no entry after that date in the volume, and the following logbook, which should have picked up the following season, is missing entirely from the archive, its absence noted only by a typed inventory card from a later decade, stating simply that the 1934 through 1935 volume could not be located. I do not know what happened to Renner, and Dale's search of the trunk didn't turn up an answer, only the abrupt silence in the record. Park Service staffing records from that era are notoriously incomplete for seasonal positions, especially at remote assignments like an isolated fire tower, and I was never able to find any personnel file that clarified whether Renner simply transferred elsewhere, finished out an uneventful career, or something else entirely happened before that missing logbook would have picked up the story again. I spent part of an afternoon back at district headquarters looking through what archived hiring records still existed, and found only a single-line entry listing G. Renner as a seasonal fire lookout for that year, with no further employment history under that name anywhere in the accessible files. While I keep coming back to, more than the sound on that still night or the stunted ring of grass beneath the cab, is that compass bearing itself, fixed and specific, appearing first in a nervous logbook entry for 1934, then found still pointed in that same direction on a piece of original equipment nearly 70 years after the tower's active staffing ended, then found rotated back to that same heading twice more during a modern pilot season despite a locked cab and no one admitting to touching it. A compass bearing is about as neutral a piece of information as exists, a number on a dial. And yet this particular one has apparently outlasted the person who first recorded it, outlasted the tower's entire period of abandonment, and reasserted itself the moment living people returned to that room. I don't have a theory that accounts for that, and after 6 seasons in that district, I stopped expecting the wilderness to hand me tidy explanations for the things that genuinely unsettled me. Some places just seem to hold onto a direction, the way a compass needle holds onto north, whether or not anyone is left to read it. The pilot season finished out without further serious incident, Dale's sleepwalking apparently stopping once Harriet started locking the firefinder in place, which she offered no theory for, and neither did I. The park has continued staffing Baldy Point seasonally since then, always with 2-person crews, and as far as I know, nothing since has escalated beyond odd sounds on still nights and one padlock that nobody on staff has ever felt the need to remove. I left the park for a position elsewhere not long after that season, but I still think about that stunted circle of grass under the cab sometimes, and about a compass bearing pointed at a patch of ordinary-looking lodgepole forest that, as far as any of us ever found out, has never once actually produced smoke. The trail that isn't on the map. I worked 8 seasons as a backcountry ranger in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, split between 2 different districts on the North Carolina side, mostly patrolling the higher elevation trail systems above 5,000 feet where the spruce fir forest starts and the crowds thin out fast. Most visitors know the Smokies for Cades Cove and Clingman's Dome and the wildflower walks in April. Almost none of them know the park has more than 800 miles of trail, a huge amount of it running through terrain steep and remote enough that search and rescue calls back there can take the better part of the day just to reach the person who needs help, even before you factor in getting them out. I want to start with something every ranger who has worked that park long enough eventually learns, which is that the Smokies keep unusually good trail records, better than most parks their size, because the trail system there has been meticulously mapped, remapped, and cross-referenced by both the Park Service and independent hiking clubs for the better part of the century. If a trail exists in that park, official or unofficial, there is almost always a paper trail behind it somewhere, an old CCC-era survey, a hiking club newsletter mentioning a route, something. That level of documentation is part of why what happened near Bone Valley Creek bothered me as much as it did, because it is the one piece of that entire trail system that has never once shown up on any map, survey, or historical record anyone has ever been able to produce, despite the fact that at least 6 of us on staff have walked it. The area in question sits above a drainage in the park's more remote southwestern section, accessed by a maintained trail that most backpackers use to reach a backcountry campsite a few miles in and then turn around or continue on to a different loop entirely. About a mile past that campsite, the maintained trail crosses a wide, flat bench of old-growth hemlock and yellow birch, mostly untouched by the logging that clear-cut much of the rest of the park before it became protected land in the 1930s. It's a beautiful, quiet stretch, and under normal daylight conditions, it looks like exactly what it is: healthy, unremarkable southern Appalachian old-growth forest with nothing unusual about it whatsoever. I first heard about the other trail from a ridge runner named Colton Briggs, a seasonal backcountry monitor who spent 7 summers patrolling that section before I ever met him, the summer I started. Ridge runners in that park do a lot of the unglamorous work, walking assigned trail sections daily during peak season, checking permits, cleaning up illegal campfires, generally being the most consistent human presence on any given stretch of trail. Colton had walked that particular bench probably 400 times over his 7 seasons, always during daylight, always on the maintained route. He told me during my first summer that there was a second trail through that same bench that only became visible at night, and only on nights with a full moon and clear sky, conditions that in southern Appalachian summer weather patterns, with their near-constant afternoon thunderstorms and heavy humidity haze, actually only line up a handful of times each year. He said he had first noticed on a night patrol he wasn't technically authorized to be doing alone, checking on a report of an illegal campsite near the bench, and had seen, in bright moonlight with the canopy gaps letting enough light through to see clearly, a second path running roughly parallel to the maintained trail but shifted maybe 30 or 40 feet off to the side, cutting a straight line through undergrowth that should have made a path like that visually indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor under normal circumstances. I did not believe him at first, and told him so, which he took with more patience than I probably deserved. He said he understood that he hadn't believed the ranger who told him about it either, a woman named Ruth in Sizemore who had retired from the park 2 years before I started, and who Colton said had first shown him the trail's existence during a full moon patrol in his 2nd season. The same way it seemed to get passed down from one person to the next once someone finally worked up the nerve to actually walk it part way. I want to be clear that for 2 full seasons after that conversation, I treated it exactly the way I treated most trail folklore, which is to say I filed it away as an interesting story and did not think much more about it. That changed in my 3rd season, on a night in early August when a ranger colleague and I happened to be doing an authorized overnight patrol of that district during a genuinely spectacular full moon, clear sky, low humidity for once, the kind of night where visibility in open forest can be remarkably good even well after dark. My colleague that night was a ranger named Priya Nair, 3 seasons in at that point, sharp and skeptical in exactly the way that made her good at the job. We reached the bench around 11 at night, well into our patrol, and I mentioned Colton's story mostly to fill the silence on a quiet stretch of trail. She laughed, said she'd heard a version of the same story from a different ridge runner the year before, and then stopped walking. She had seen it before I said another word. Off to our left, maybe 30 feet from the maintained trail, cutting through what should have been a solid wall of rhododendron and undergrowth too dense to walk through without a machete, there was a clean, narrow gap, moonlit well enough to see it ran arrow straight into the trees, disappearing into deeper shadow after maybe 60 or 70 feet of visible distance. We stood there for a long moment, both of us saying nothing, and then Priya said the thing I remember most clearly from that entire night, which is that the gap had not been there when we walked past that exact spot 2 hours earlier heading the opposite direction, during full daylight, on our way out to check the backcountry site. We did not walk it that night. Park protocol on unauthorized routes is straightforward, and neither of us had any operational reason to go investigate an unmapped trail alone after dark with no one aware of our specific position beyond the general patrol area. We logged it factually in our patrol report the next morning, the same way you'd log any trail anomaly, and I brought it to my supervisor, a district ranger named Walter Combs who had been with that park for over 2 decades. He was not surprised. He told me it had been quietly known among senior staff for years, never formally investigated because it had never posed any documented safety hazard, never harmed anyone, and never showed up consistently enough during daylight hours or under normal survey conditions to justify committing search and rescue or trail crew resources to formally mapping something that, as far as anyone could prove, functionally did not exist most nights of the year. He did tell me one thing that stuck with me, though, which is that in 1989, before his time, but relayed to him by the same Ruth and Sizemore who had shown Colton, a backpacker had gone missing for 11 hours from a legal campsite near that bench during a full moon week in August, found the following morning sitting calmly on the maintained trail almost 2 miles from where his tent was pitched, with no memory of leaving his campsite and no explanation for how he'd covered that distance through dense, trailless terrain in the dark without a single scratch, torn piece of clothing, or any sign of having pushed through the undergrowth that should have made that route physically impossible to walk. The man told rangers at the time that he remembered walking a path the whole way, a clear, easy path, and remembered nothing else about the night beyond that single detail before waking up disoriented on trail at dawn. I brought that story to Colton, who told me it matched almost exactly what Ruth had told him, down to the detail about the missing hiker insisting there had been an easy, clear path the entire time, despite the terrain making that claim essentially impossible under normal forest conditions. Neither of us had an explanation, and Walter, when I pushed him on it directly, told me he didn't have one either. Only 20 years of quietly making sure nobody camped too close to that bench during full moon weeks, if he could help it. A soft, unofficial practice that had apparently been passed down the same informal way the story itself had, ranger to ranger, without ever becoming a written policy. I went back to that bench exactly once more during a full moon in my 6th season, alone against my own better judgment and everything I'd learned by then about how these things tend to go in remote backcountry. I want to describe what I found honestly. The gap in the undergrowth was there again, in almost precisely the same location Priya, and I had seen it 3 years earlier, same width, same arrow straight line, disappearing into shadow. I stood at its edge for a long time. I did not step onto it. I photographed it the way I document any trail anomaly, and the photograph, when I reviewed it later, showed exactly what I'd seen with my own eyes, a clear gap in dense rhododendron that should not have been possible to create or maintain without regular clearing, in a section of forest with no trail crew assignment and no record of any maintenance ever being performed there. While I stood there, I did something I hadn't planned on doing, which was to shine my headlamp directly down the gap at full brightness instead of relying on moonlight alone. I want to describe exactly what that did, because it surprised me. Under moonlight, the path had looked clean and inviting, an easy walk through open forest. Under the direct beam of my headlamp, the light seemed to travel a much shorter distance than it should have, illuminating maybe 15 or 20 feet clearly before appearing to simply stop, not fade gradually the way a headlamp beam normally does over distance in open forest, but end abruptly, as though the space beyond that point were somehow absorbing the light rather than simply being too far away to reach. I tried adjusting the beam, widening it, narrowing it to a spot, and got the same result each time. Moonlight seemed to reach the path just fine, illuminating it invisibly far into the trees, but my own artificial light would not travel more than a few feet past where I stood. I did not investigate that further. I turned around and walked back to the maintained trail and did not look behind me until I reached a bend where the bench was no longer visible. Before I left the park for good, I made a point of tracking down Ruth and Sizemore, the retired ranger both Colton and Walter had credited as the original source of the story going back decades. She was in her 70s by then, living in a small town not far from the park boundary, and she agreed to talk with me over coffee one afternoon when I explained who I was and what I'd seen. Ruth had a way of talking about the whole thing that I found more unsettling than anything Colton or Walter had offered, mostly because she treated it with such plain, practical acceptance, the way you talk about a stretch of highway that ices over every winter regardless of how many times the county salts it. She told me the story of the missing backpacker herself, since she had been one of the rangers on duty during the search that night in 1989, and she filled in a detail Walter hadn't known or hadn't passed along, which was that the man's tent, when they found it the next morning still standing exactly as he'd left it, showed no sign of him ever having unzipped it to leave in the normal way. The zipper pull was still positioned from the inside, the way you'd leave it if you climbed out through the small gap at the top rather than fully opening the door, an odd detail nobody could explain, since the man himself remembered nothing about how he'd left the tent at all, only that he had been lying awake looking up at the moon through the mesh ceiling one moment and walking a clear, easy path through the dark the next. She was not surprised by anything I described, including the detail about my headlamp, which she said matched her own experience almost exactly from a night in the early 1990s when she had done the same thing out of the same instinct to test the light with something more controllable than moonlight. She told me she had asked around the park's administrative archives at one point, years into her career, trying to find any historical record predating the park's establishment in 1934 that might explain the bench's reputation, back when that land was still privately held by Appalachian families before the government bought them out to create the park. She found almost nothing directly, government land acquisition record from that era being spotty at best for individual parcels. But she did find one brief mention in an oral history project the park conducted in the 1970s, interviewing elderly former residents about their memories of the land before it became parkland. One interview, with a woman who would have been a child in that area in the early 1900s, included a passing comment, almost thrown away in the middle of an otherwise unrelated story about her family's homestead, that her mother had always told the children not to go up near that particular bench after dark during a full moon, because, in the old woman's words as recorded in the transcript, that was when the old road showed itself, and the old road did not lead anywhere a person was meant to go. The interviewer apparently did not follow up on the comment, and it sits in the transcript as a single unexplained line with no further context. Decades before the park ever existed, decades before any of us ever stood at the edge of that gap with a compass or a camera or a headlamp that wouldn't quite reach far enough to show us what we were looking at. I no longer work in that park, though I still think about that bench sometimes, especially on clear nights when I happen to notice a full moon overhead somewhere far from any mountain. Great Smoky Mountains keeps some of the best trail records of any park in this country. Decades of maps, surveys, and cross-checked historical documentation covering nearly every mile of maintained and unofficial trail within its boundaries. And there is still one clear, straight path through old-growth hemlock that has never once appeared in any of it, that 6 of us have seen with our own eyes under a full moon, that at least one elderly former resident's mother was warning her children away from over a century ago, and that not one of us has ever been willing to walk more than a few feet into. The radio call from Sector 7. I worked 7 seasons as a backcountry ranger in Glacier National Park, most of it in the park's more remote northern district near the Canadian border, an area of steep glacial valleys, cliff bands, and weather that can turn from clear sky to whiteout in under 20 minutes, even in July. Search and rescue work up there is different from almost anywhere else in the lower 48 because of how quickly conditions change and how little margin for error the terrain gives you. Radio discipline is drilled into every ranger from day one, because in a lot of that backcountry, a working radio is the only thing standing between a bad afternoon and a body recovery operation. The park's backcountry radio network is organized into sectors, numbered zones, each covering a chunk of terrain, with repeaters positioned on ridgelines and peaks to relay signal across valleys that would otherwise block direct transmission. Most of those sectors get regular, mundane radio traffic all season, patrol check-ins, weather updates, the occasional real emergency call that gets everyone's full attention fast. Sector 7 is different and has been different for longer than anyone currently on staff has been alive. Sector 7 covers a drainage on the park's northeastern edge, a valley accessed by a trail that sees maybe a few dozen backcountry permits a year, while below the park's more popular routes, mostly because the approach is long and the terrain past a certain point turns technical enough that casual hikers select out of it. There is a repeater on a ridge above that drainage, original equipment from the 1970s that has been upgraded and maintained over the decades like every other repeater in the system, functioning exactly the way it's supposed to for the vast majority of the time. The problem, and I want to be precise about how I first learned this, because precision is the only thing that has made this story feel manageable to hold on to, is that every single year, always sometime in the narrow window between the last week of July and the first week of August, and always sometime after 10 at night, a distress call comes through on the Sector 7 frequency. It has happened every year on record going back as far as the park's radio logs have been digitized, which puts a documented, verified pattern back to the early 1990s, and informal recollection from retired staff pushes the pattern back considerably further than that, possibly to the repeater's original installation. The call is always close to identical. A male voice, sounding to most who've heard it like a man in his 20s or 30s, transmitting on the Sector 7 frequency, giving a distress report, injured alone, specific but slightly inconsistent details about his location from year to year, always somewhere in that same general drainage. Always asking for help in a voice that most rangers who've heard it describe as calm on the surface, but with something underneath the calm that unsettled them more than panic would have. The transmission typically lasts somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, and then cuts off, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes with what sounds like static swallowing the last few words. Every single year, protocol requires the on-duty ranger to treat it as a real emergency, because it has to be treated that way, because the alternative, ignoring a distress call on the off chance it isn't real, is not something any search and rescue program can responsibly do. Every single year, a team is dispatched into that drainage as fast as conditions and daylight allow. And every single year, for over 3 decades of documented searches, nobody has ever been found. No injured hiker, no permit holder unaccounted for, no missing persons report anywhere in the system that matches the timing or description. The searches always come back with nothing, the drainage checked as thoroughly as terrain and time allow, and the following year, in that same narrow window, the same call comes through again. I first heard about it during my second season, from a district supervisor named Frank Delgado who had been with the park for over 20 years at that point and had personally responded to the call 4 separate times across his career. He told me about it during a slow afternoon at the ranger station, not as a ghost story exactly, more as an operational briefing, the kind of thing every new backcountry ranger in that district eventually needed to know, because it was functionally part of the job. He was matter-of-fact about it in a way that somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd played it up for drama. He told me the transmission was real, verifiable, recorded on the station's radio logs every year, and that the searches were real too, full deployments, sometimes involving helicopter support when weather allowed, and that in over 20 documented years nobody had ever found so much as a footprint that didn't belong to the search team itself. I asked him the obvious question, whether anyone had ever tried to identify the voice, run it against missing persons databases, anything like that. He said it had been tried more than once over the decades, park administration taking it seriously enough in the 1990s to actually send a recording to a state crime lab for voice analysis, hoping to at least narrow down an age range or regional accent that might help identify who was calling. The analysis came back inconclusive in an odd way. He said, not because the recording was too degraded to analyze, but because the lab's own equipment kept producing what the accompanying report described as internally inconsistent waveform data, essentially meaning the recording didn't behave the way a normal human voice recording should when run through standard acoustic analysis. Without the report ever explaining clearly what that meant in practical terms. He added that the technician who ran the analysis had apparently called the district office directly rather than simply mailing back the written report, an unusual step Frank said stuck with him, and had asked, almost off the record, whether the recording could possibly have been made using more than one microphone or source layer together. Because certain frequency bands in the audio behaved as though two separate points of origin were somehow present in a single continuous transmission. Frank told him he had no way of answering that, since the recording had come straight off the station's own receiver with no editing of any kind, and the technician hadn't pushed the question further. Frank said the report itself was eventually filed away and mostly forgotten, and nobody since had pushed hard enough to request a second analysis with more modern equipment. I heard the call myself for the first time in my third season, on duty alone at the district station on the night of July 30th, monitoring the radio the way every on-duty ranger does during a normal evening shift. It came through a little after 11, sector 7 frequency, exactly as Frank had described. I want to try to convey what it actually sounded like, though I've never fully managed to describe it to anyone who wasn't there. The voice was clear, not degraded by static the way you'd expect from a weak signal bouncing off a distant repeater in mountainous terrain. It gave a location description, mentioning a rock slide area partway up the drainage, said he'd fallen, said his leg was hurt, asked for help in a tone that stayed level and controlled the entire time. No panic in the voice itself, which is what struck me most, because genuine distress calls from injured hikers almost never sound that composed. Then, right in the middle of a sentence describing how far he thought he'd fallen, the transmission cut to silence. No static tail, no click of a radio being released. Just an abrupt, total silence that felt more like the call had been switched off from the transmitting end than lost to distance or terrain. I followed protocol exactly, logged the call, initiated the search response, and spent the rest of that night and most of the next day as part of a 4-person team working our way up that drainage in daylight, checking every plausible location that matched the rockslide description given over the radio. We found an area that matched reasonably well, a genuine rockslide zone about 2/3 of the way up the valley, and searched it thoroughly, along with the surrounding terrain for a considerable distance in every direction. No sign of anyone. No disturbed rock consistent with a recent fall. No blood. No drop gear. No footprints beyond what our own team was creating as we searched. We checked every permit on file for that drainage going back several weeks. Every permit holder was accounted for, either already checked out of the backcountry or confirmed safe and located elsewhere in the park through radio contact or trailhead sign-out logs. I want to be honest that for the rest of that season, the whole experience unsettled me in a low-grade, persistent way that I didn't fully process until the following winter, when I had time away from the park to actually sit with it. What bothered me most, more than the eerie calm in the voice or the abrupt cutoff, was the location detail itself, because it had been specific enough and geographically plausible enough that the search team had genuinely believed, right up until we'd covered every square foot of that rockslide zone, that we were about to find someone. Whoever or whatever was transmitting knew that terrain well enough to describe a real, physically consistent location within that drainage, which argued against the whole thing being some kind of prank or misdirected signal bleeding in from outside the park, the kind of mundane explanation everyone, myself included, wanted badly to believe. I talked to 3 other rangers over the following seasons who had each independently responded to the call in different years, and their accounts matched mine closely enough that I stopped looking for an innocent explanation. 2 of them described the same eerie calm in the voice. One described a slightly different location, further up the drainage near a small tarn, but equally specific and equally plausible and equally unconfirmed by any physical evidence during the resulting search. All of them described the same abrupt cutoff mid-sentence, never a natural sounding end to the transmission, always cut off as if something had reached out and simply switched it off partway through a word. One of those rangers, a young seasonal hire named Marcus Ibarra, who had only been with the park a single season when he responded to the call, told me something the others hadn't mentioned, either because they hadn't noticed it or because they decided not to bring it up. He said that during the hours-long hike back out after his team search came up empty, while after sunrise with the whole valley lit up in ordinary daylight, he'd had the distinct and persistent feeling of being watched from somewhere above the trail, high on the valley wall, a feeling strong enough that he stopped twice to scan the slope with binoculars, finding nothing both times, no movement, no glint of anything reflective, nothing to account for the sensation. He said the feeling faded gradually as the team descended and lost it entirely once they crossed back below the treeline, and that he had never experienced anything like it before or since in 7 subsequent seasons working elsewhere in the park. The most unsettling account came from a ranger named Elena Whitfield, who had responded to the call in a year when weather-grounded helicopter support and the search team had to hike the entire approach on foot, arriving at the described location well after dawn instead of overnight the way most responses managed. She told me that as her team worked through the rockslide area at first light, her radio, tuned to the standard operations channel rather than Sector 7 specifically, briefly picked up a few seconds of what she described as the same voice, not transmitting a full message this time, just a short fragment, close enough to being intelligible that she was certain it was the same man, though she could never afterward say with confidence what the fragment of words actually was. She said it happened once, lasted maybe 2 seconds, and never repeated for the rest of that search, and that she never mentioned in her official incident report because she didn't know how to write it down in a way that wouldn't sound like she was cracking under the stress of an overnight rescue hike, even though she insisted, when she told me privately years later that she had never been more certain of anything she'd heard in her life. Frank retired the year before I left the park myself, and in one of our last conversations before he moved out of state, I asked him directly whether he had a theory after over 2 decades of dealing with this pattern personally. He told me he'd stopped looking for one a long time ago, that the only thing he'd learned to do with any real confidence was respond exactly the way protocol required every single time, treat it as a genuine emergency, search as thoroughly as conditions allowed, and then let it go until the following July, because the alternative, sitting with the unanswered question year-round, was not something he thought any of us were built to carry indefinitely. Before he left, though, he did tell me one more piece of the pattern that I had never heard from anyone else, something he said he'd pieced together slowly over his own 2 decades rather than learned all at once from someone before him. He said that if you went back through the archived radio logs carefully enough, further than the digitized records that only went back to the early 90s, into an old bound logbook kept at the district station that predated any digital system, you could find handwritten entries describing the same call going back to at least 1968, the earliest year the station had reliable radio equipment in that sector at all. He said the wording of the distress call, based on those old handwritten summaries, had shifted slightly over the decades in small ways. References to gear and terminology that matched whatever era each entry was written in. A 1970s entry mentioning a specific brand of external frame pack that hadn't been manufactured in decades. A later entry, using more modern language about a twisted rather than broken leg. He said it was as if whoever or whatever was transmitting had, in some fashion neither of us could explain, kept pace with the passage of time itself, updating the specific details of the story it told, while keeping the core shape of the call, the location, the calm voice, the abrupt cutoff, essentially unchanged across more than 50 years. That detail bothered me more than almost anything else I learned during my time in that district, because it undermined the one theory I had privately been holding on to without ever saying out loud, which was some version of an old, tragic, unresolved event from decades earlier repeating itself on a fixed loop. A genuine historical death whose circumstances simply never changed because the person themselves was frozen at the moment they died. A fixed historical tragedy should sound the same every time, use the same equipment, the same language appropriate to whenever that original event actually happened. This did not do that. This adapted slowly, deliberately, in step with the world outside that drainage, which suggested to me something considerably stranger than a single repeating memory, something that was, in whatever sense applies to a thing like this, still paying attention. I asked Frank once, half joking in an attempt to lighten a conversation that had gotten heavier than either of us intended, what he thought would happen if a search team ever did find someone during one of these responses. He didn't laugh. He said he honestly didn't know, and that in over 20 years of thinking about it on and off, he had never once let himself fully imagine the answer, because some part of him suspected that finding an explanation might turn out to be considerably worse than simply never finding one at all. I have thought about that answer more than almost anything else he ever told me during our years working together. I no longer work in that park, but I still think about Sector 7 every year around the end of July, usually without meaning to, the date simply surfacing in my mind the way an anniversary does whether you want it to or not. I still keep a handheld scanner in a drawer at home, an old habit from the job that I never quite broke, and more than once in the years since I left I have caught myself, late on a July night, tempted to program in that old frequency, just to see, before deciding against it every single time. As far as I know, the park still treats it exactly the way we always did, a real distress call requiring a real response, logged, searched, and left unresolved, waiting for the same narrow window to come around again the following summer, in a drainage that has never once, in over 3 decades of documented searches, given up whoever or whatever is calling for help. The ranger who never signed out. I've worked backcountry patrol in Everglades National Park for 9 seasons, mostly out of the park's more remote southern district, the section most visitors never see, hours by boat from the nearest paved road, a maze of mangrove tunnels, open bays, and sawgrass prairie that floods and dries on a cycle most people never think about when they picture Florida wilderness. It is not the kind of terrain most people associate with feeling lost. No mountains, no dense forest canopy, just water and grass and mangrove stretching flat in every direction. But I want to tell you, terrain that flat and that featureless can disorient a person just as badly as any mountain range. Worse in some ways, because there is nothing to use as a landmark once the light starts to go, and the channels between the mangrove islands shift constantly with tide and storm, meaning a route you took confidently last month may simply not exist in the same form today. Every ranger who works that district long enough eventually hears about Wade Sutton, and most of us hear about him before we've even finished our first season, because his case is still, formally, an open missing persons file with the National Park Service, one of the very few unsolved ranger disappearances in the agency's history. And it happened close enough to where we work every day that it is impossible not to think about him at certain times in certain places. Wade Sutton was a backcountry ranger stationed in that same southern district back in the winter of 1974, working what was then a much smaller and less funded ranger corps than exists in the park today. By all account, from the few people still alive who worked with him, he was well regarded, experienced, comfortable in that terrain in a way that took most rangers years to develop. He had grown up nearby, had spent his childhood fishing and hunting in the backcountry long before he ever became a ranger, and knew the channels and islands of that district as well as anyone who has ever worked there before or since. On the morning of February 11th, 1974, Wade signed out for a routine solo patrol, a standard boat patrol checking a series of backcountry campsites scattered through the island south of the ranger station, expected back before dark the same day. That sign-out sheet, the physical paper log kept at every backcountry station documenting who is out, where they're headed, and when they're expected back, is still in the park's archive files. It has his name, the date, his planned route, and an expected return time of 5 in the afternoon. There is no corresponding sign and entry anywhere in the log for that day, or any day after it. Wade Sutton signed out that morning, and as far as any official record shows, never came back. The search that followed was by the standards of 1974 backcountry search and rescue. Extensive. His boat was found the following day, anchored, undamaged, engine in working order, at a site well within his planned patrol route, near a backcountry campsite the park still uses today. There is no sign of struggle, no distress markers, nothing to suggest an accident on the water itself. His gear was mostly still aboard, radio included, though the radio, when recovered, was found switched off, which struck the search team at the time as unusual, since standard protocol even then called for keeping the radio on and monitoring the assigned channel throughout a solo patrol. Ground search teams, working from the boat's location outward, covered the nearby islands as thoroughly as terrain and time allowed. But that terrain does not forgive careless searching or reward it either. Mangrove thickets dense enough in places to require cutting a path by hand, tidal mud that swallows footprints within hours, water access that limits how far on foot any search team can realistically push before running out of daylight or usable ground. After 11 days of active search, involving personnel from multiple agencies and, for the era, a genuinely significant use of aircraft for aerial search, the operation was scaled back, then eventually closed without ever finding any further trace of Wade Sutton. No body, no clothing, no equipment beyond what had already been recovered from the boat itself. I want to be clear that missing persons cases like this, tragic as they are not by themselves unusual in remote wilderness. People die in backcountry accidents every year across the park system, and sometimes bodies are never recovered, swallowed by terrain that makes recovery genuinely difficult even when searchers know roughly where to look. What makes Wade Sutton's case different? What has kept his name alive among backcountry rangers in that district for 50 years now is not the disappearance itself, but what has allegedly happened in the decades since, reported independently by enough different rangers across enough different years that has become, functionally, an accepted piece of institutional knowledge in that district, even though it has never once been formally documented in any official park record. I first heard the details from a senior ranger named Odell Marchetti during my second season, a soft-spoken man who had worked that district for over 15 years by the time I met him, and who, I would later learn, had his own direct experience with what people in that district simply call Wade's Channel, an unofficial name for a specific stretch of water near where the boat was originally found, a name that appears on no park map, but that every ranger in that district learns within there. First year regardless. Odell told me the name itself had never been officially sanctioned or printed on any document, yet every new hire somehow absorbed it within their first few months on the job, passed along the same way trail crews pass along which creek crossings run dangerous after heavy rain, practical knowledge that outlives any individual person's tenure because the district itself seems to insist on remembering it. Odell told me that starting sometime in the years after Wade's disappearance, though nobody could tell me exactly when the pattern began, rangers on solo patrol through that specific channel, always alone, always either very early morning or after dusk when light is poor, have periodically reported picking up a brief radio transmission on the district standard patrol frequency. A few seconds of a man's voice comm, giving what sounds like a routine check-in, stating a location and a time, before cutting to silence. The strange part, Odell said, the part that has kept this from ever being dismissed as simple radio interference or a stray signal bleeding in from some other source, is that the location given in the transmission is always, specifically, a site along Wade Sutton's original 1974 patrol route, and the time given is always some variation of an afternoon check-in, roughly consistent with what a rotation like his would have called for at that point in the day. Odell had heard it himself exactly once, 6 years into his own career, running a routine solo patrol through that channel on a quiet February afternoon, close enough to the anniversary of the original disappearance that he said the timing bothered him more afterward than the transmission itself had in the moment. He described a few seconds of a man's voice, unhurried, giving a site name that matched a real backcountry campsite along that stretch of channel, followed by check-in time, and then nothing, no further transmission, no response when Odell tried to raise whoever had spoken on the same frequency. He logged it in his own personal notes rather than any official report, mostly because he didn't know how to write it up in a way that wouldn't sound like he was imagining things, and because, as he put it to me, everyone in that district already knew about it anyway, so there seemed little point making it official. I did not experience anything myself for the first 6 seasons I worked that district, long enough that I had started to assume the story. However consistently it kept getting told in new rangers by people like Odell was simply an old piece of institutional folklore that had outlived any real basis in fact. The kind of thing remote outposts tend to generate over enough decades regardless of whether anything genuinely unexplained ever happened. That changed in my 7th season, on a solo afternoon patrol in early February, close enough to the anniversary date that I want to be honest, I was thinking about Wade Sutton at least a little before anything happened, simply because of the time of year and because I happened to be running the same general stretch of channel that morning. I was monitoring the standard patrol frequency the way protocol requires. Nothing unusual through most of the morning, ordinary chatter from other rangers elsewhere in the district, weather updates, the normal background noise of a working radio network. A little after 2 in the afternoon, running the boat slow through a narrow mangrove tunnel section of the channel, my radio picked up a brief transmission that was not on the standard hailing pattern any of us actually use, a man's voice comm giving a location I recognized immediately as a real backcountry campsite further down that same channel, followed by what sounded like a time check, roughly consistent. I realized only afterward, with an expected mid-afternoon patrol update. The transmission lasted maybe 4 or 5 seconds before cutting to dead silence. No static tail, no click of a radio releasing, simply gone. I tried raising whoever had spoken, using the same frequency, standard hailing procedure, twice, with no response. I checked my own radio's channel display to confirm I hadn't accidentally drifted onto some unusual frequency, and it showed the standard district patrol channel exactly where it should have been. I finished my patrol route that day without any further incident, reached every site on my list, found nothing unusual at any of them, and returned to the station before dark exactly on schedule. I want to describe one more account secondhand that Odell shared with me that same conversation from a ranger who had worked that district in the 1990s and had since retired, a man named Curtis Boyle whom Odell had known personally for years. According to Odell, Curtis had experienced something slightly different from the rest, a solo night patrol rather than an afternoon run, and had reported not just hearing the brief radio transmission, but also, shortly afterward, seeing a single point of light moving slowly through a distant stretch of mangrove along that same channel, low to the water, moving at a pace and in a manner consistent with someone walking carefully through shallow water with a lantern or flashlight in an area with. No maintained trail, no campsite, and no reason for any legitimate patrol or visitor to be present at that hour. Curtis reportedly watched the light for close to a minute before it simply went out, not dimming gradually the way a failing flashlight battery would, but ending all at once. And he chose not to investigate further given the hour, the terrain, and, in his own words as Odell relayed them to me, a very clear feeling that whatever was carrying that light did not want company. Odell also told me something about Wade Sutton himself that I hadn't known before, a detail that had been passed down among the district's longest-serving staff, but never written into any official file, because it came from a conversation Wade's former supervisor had with Odell's own mentor decades earlier, long before Odell ever started the job. Apparently, Wade had mentioned to a few people in the weeks before his disappearance that he'd been noticing something odd about that particular channel on his regular patrols, a stretch of water that seemed, in his words, to run differently depending on the time of day, channels that should have connected the same way every trip, sometimes requiring a longer route than they had the week before, as though the mangrove islands themselves were shifting position slightly between visits in a way that didn't match anything he understood about normal tidal or storm-driven change in that ecosystem. He apparently mentioned it casually, more as an observation about difficult navigation than any kind of concern, the way an experienced waterman might comment on unusually strong currents without treating it as anything sinister. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It only became meaningful in hindsight, after he vanished from exactly that stretch of water without a trace. I found myself thinking about that detail for a long time after Odell told me, because it lined up in an uncomfortable way with something I had noticed myself over the years without ever really articulating it, which is that specific channel, more than any other stretch of water I regularly patrol in that district, has always felt subtly harder to hold a consistent mental map of than it should. I have run that channel dozens of times, know its major landmarks well, and yet more than once I have found myself needing to double-check my position against a chart in a way I rarely need to elsewhere in the backcountry, a small, persistent uncertainty about exactly how far I traveled or exactly which turn came next, the kind of thing easy to write off as ordinary distraction or fatigue. But that has happened to me there specifically, consistently, in a way it hasn't happened anywhere else. In 9 seasons of working that district, I did not mention it to anyone for almost a week, partly out of the same instinct Odell had described, not wanting to sound like I was imagining things, and partly, I'll admit, because some part of me wanted to talk myself into a mundane explanation before I said anything out loud that would make it feel more real. I eventually told Odell, and he asked me, before I'd given him any details beyond the fact that something had happened, whether it had come in around early February, near the channel, giving a site name and a time check. When I confirmed all 3 details matched what he described from his own experience years earlier, he was quiet for a moment, and then told me that made at least 6 documented instances he personally knew of across roughly 4 decades, of rangers independently reporting close to the same transmission, always in that narrow window of time each February, always along that same stretch of channel, always cutting off after a few seconds with no further response. The park has never formally investigated any of this, and I don't say that as a criticism, because there is genuinely nothing here that rises to the level of an actionable lead in a 50-year-old missing persons case. A handful of unverifiable radio transmissions, and 1 second-hand account of a light in the mangroves, none of it the kind of evidence that reopens a cold case file. But among the rangers who actually work that district, year after year, it has become something closer to an accepted, quietly held piece of local knowledge, the same way a fishing crew might quietly avoid a stretch of water without ever needing to formally explain why to each new deckhand who joins them. I still work that district today, and every February, when my rotation happens to put me anywhere near that stretch of channel, I find myself listening a little more closely to the radio than I otherwise would, half hoping I won't hear anything, and half, if I'm honest, hoping that if I do, it might finally be different, might finally carry some detail that could actually help close a case that has stayed open for 50 years now, waiting on a man who signed out on a February morning in 1974 and never signed back in. I mentioned earlier that Wade's radio was found switched off aboard his anchored boat, which the original search team flagged as unusual at the time, given standard protocol. I think about that detail more than almost any other piece of the case because it means that whatever happened to him, however it happened, there was apparently a moment where he made a deliberate choice to turn that radio off before whatever came next. Rangers do not casually switch off their only line of communication in the middle of a solo patrol through terrain like that. Not by habit, not by accident, and Wade Sutton, by every account of the kind of ranger he was, would have understood exactly what turning that dial meant. I don't know what he heard or saw or decided in that moment, and I don't expect I ever will. But it is the detail that keeps me from ever fully dismissing any of this as coincidence or shared imagination among a group of rangers isolated enough, for long enough, to start believing the same story simply because everyone around them already did. Something made an experienced, capable man switch off his radio in the middle of a workday, in water he knew better than almost anyone alive, and walk away from a boat that was never found with so much as a scuff mark to explain where he went. The name on Iron Cap Summit. Ranger Christopher Landry had worked the Iron Cap district in the Wyoming high country for 6 years before he learned that the metal register box bolted to the summit cairn sometimes signed a climber in before they ever reached the top themselves. It started with a missing climber call that came in on a clear, cold September morning. Exactly the kind of stable weather window that drew serious mountaineers to attempt Iron Cap's technically demanding final pitch before the season's first real snowfall closed the route entirely. A man named Eric Sandoval, 33 years old, an experienced alpinist attempting a solo summit push after his climbing partner had turned back the previous day due to altitude sickness, had failed to check in by radio from the summit at his planned time of 10 that morning, and had missed his subsequent, more urgent check in an hour later as well. Christopher pulled the climbing permit before heading up. Solo summit attempt following a partner's descent. Extensive high-altitude experience listed. Weather window confirmed stable through the following afternoon. Nothing in the file suggested anything beyond the ordinary risk of a solo climber running behind schedule on a technically demanding final approach. He started up the final approach route a little after 11 that morning. The thin, cold air at this elevation making even his own conditioned lungs work harder than usual with every step. Iron Cap Summit sat just over 13,000 feet, its final pitch requiring genuine technical climbing rather than simple hiking, a challenge that had made the peak a respected objective among serious mountaineers for generations. The summit register itself, a simple metal box bolted securely to the rock cairn marking the true summit, had been maintained by the district for decades. A small spiral notebook inside where successful climbers recorded their names and the date of their ascent. Locals called this particular register the early book on account of an old story about how, on certain climbs, a solo climber reaching the summit found their own name already written inside, in their own unmistakable handwriting, dated to a climb they had not yet actually completed. Christopher found Eric's ice axe planted upright in the snow near the base of the final technical pitch almost immediately, positioned with careful, deliberate precision rather than simply dropped in a moment of struggle. He called out Eric's name, and the sound moved strangely across the thin mountain air, carrying an unusually long distance given the altitude's typically muffling effect on sound, returning an echo off the surrounding rock faces that arrived distorted and layered, as though it had bounced off surfaces considerably closer than the actual terrain allowed. He continued up the technical pitch himself, moving carefully but efficiently through terrain he had climbed many times before during routine patrols, and reached the summit a little after noon. The register box sat exactly where it always had, bolted securely to the summit cairn. Christopher opened it out of habit, intending to check for any recent entry from Eric that might indicate he had reached the top before whatever had happened to him occurred. Eric's name was already written inside, in careful, confident handwriting, dated to that same morning, time-stamped at 9:45, 15 minutes before his first missed radio check and was actually scheduled to occur. Christopher stared at the entry for a long moment, his own breath fogging heavily in the thin, freezing air. He knew for a fact, from the radio logs and Eric's own confirmed position reported by his descending partner the previous evening, that Eric could not possibly have reached this summit before 10 that morning at the absolute earliest, given the technical difficulty of the final pitch and his solo climbing pace. His radio crackled with static as he continued examining the register, the signal notably weaker than it should have been this close to the summit, where reception was normally at its most reliable throughout the entire district. He tried reporting his position anyway, uncertain whether the message actually carried back to dispatch. Local folklore around this particular summit had always included scattered references to the register box itself, stories Christopher had heard in fragments over his years working this district, tales about how it occasionally recorded a climber's name and summit time before that climber had actually reached the top, as though the mountain itself had somehow already witnessed the ascent taking place, and that the climber, upon eventually arriving for real, was simply catching up to something that had, in some sense, already happened to them. He had dismissed these stories the way he dismissed most local folklore, charming color passed down through generations of mountain guides who simply enjoyed a good scare while briefing clients before a demanding technical ascent. Standing here now, holding proof of an impossible early entry in Eric's own unmistakable handwriting, that dismissal felt considerably harder to maintain. He began his descent back down the technical pitch, calling Eric's name at steady intervals, and it was perhaps 20 minutes later, near a narrow ledge partway down the route, where climbers commonly paused to rest before the final push, that he heard Eric's voice calling out from somewhere below him on the mountain. "Christopher, is that you?" The voice called, thin and disoriented sounding. "I do not know how I got turned around. I think I have been climbing for a lot longer than I meant to." Christopher hesitated, remembering the impossible summit entry only minutes earlier. He called back carefully, keeping his own voice level. "This is Ranger Landry. Tell me what time your partner actually turned back yesterday." There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too smooth, too composed for a genuinely lost and frightened climber stranded somewhere on a technically demanding mountain face. "I do not remember that right now. I am cold and confused. Please just come find me instead of asking questions." Christopher felt the thin mountain air around him grow suddenly and unnaturally still, the constant, biting wind that normally scoured this exposed ridge falling silent all at once. And along the rock face beside him, he noticed something that made his stomach drop, faint markings scratched into the stone, initials and a date matching, unmistakably, the impossible summit entry he had just found. The carving weathered in a way that suggested years of exposure, despite the date scratched into it. Being barely hours old, he backed away from the sound carefully, refusing to descend toward it directly, and the stillness around him deepened further still, patient and unhurried, as though confident he could not remain suspended on this exposed ridge forever without eventually giving in. Christopher continued his careful descent along the established route rather than deviating toward the sound, and it was nearly 30 minutes later, reaching a wider section of terrain below the technical pitch with a route briefly leveled out, that he finally found Eric. He stood pressed close against a rock outcropping, one gloved hand resting flat against the stone exactly where similar faint carvings clustered thickest, motionless, staring at his own fingers with an expression that made Christopher's chest tighten with dread the moment he got close enough to see it clearly. Eric did not turn at the sound of his own name being called. He simply stood there, swaying gently despite the technical terrain demanding careful balance. And Christopher noticed with rising horror that the rock beneath Eric's palm had begun to darken slightly, a faint discoloration spreading outward from his fingertips in a pattern that looked unmistakably like it was beginning to carve something new into the stone. "Eric," Christopher called out firmly, moving carefully across the exposed terrain toward him, keeping his voice as warm and steady as he could manage despite his racing pulse and the genuine danger of their current position. "It is Ranger Landry. Your partner radioed in when you missed your check-in. Let's get you off this face." The man turned toward the sound slowly, and for one long, unsettling moment his eyes held the same flat, patient quality Christopher had sensed in the impossible summit entry only minutes earlier, nothing like genuine human fear or confusion. Then something shifted behind his expression, a crack of real recognition breaking through, and he blinked rapidly, pulling his hand back from the rock as though only just now noticing where it had been resting, swaying dangerously on his feet as though waking from a deep and disorienting sleep. "I do not understand," Eric said, his voice suddenly thin and frightened in a way that finally sounded entirely his own, gripping the rock face properly now with both hands as genuine climbing instinct reasserted itself. "I remember starting the final pitch, checking my protection placement. Then there's this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name, and me realizing my hand has been pressed against this rock for I do not know how long, in a spot with no actual holds to speak of." Christopher moved quickly to help him secure a proper anchor point, clipping him into a solid protection placement before allowing either of them to relax even slightly given their exposed position. Once he confirmed Eric was genuinely secure, Christopher began guiding him carefully down the remaining terrain toward easier ground. "We are heading down together," Christopher told him firmly. "Keep your eyes on the route and on your own hands. Do not trust any hold that does not have solid rock actually beneath it." Eric nodded shakily, his breathing coming in quick, uneven gasps as Christopher guided him through the careful process of descending the technical terrain, refusing to let either of their attention drift toward the surrounding rock face for longer than the climbing itself strictly required. "I keep trying to remember what actually happened," Eric said once they finally reached easier, walkable terrain below the technical pitch. "I remember the summit felt so close. I could practically see the cairn from where I was climbing. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice telling me to look at the route instead of wherever I was looking before." Christopher did not press him further, focused instead on getting them both safely down to base camp before the weather window's stability became any less certain. It was only once Eric had been safely delivered to his waiting partner and Christopher had radioed in confirmation of the recovery that he allowed himself to fully process what he had found in that register box. Christopher filed his official report listing Eric Sandoval as safely recovered after becoming disoriented during a technically demanding solo ascent, citing altitude effects and the challenging nature of the final pitch as contributing factors in his confusion. He made no mention of a voice that had worn Eric's tone like an ill-fitting costume, of an impossible register entry timestamp before Eric's actual, confirmed summit time, or of rock that had darkened in a deliberate, spreading pattern beneath a motionless hand suspended on genuinely dangerous terrain. His supervisor approved the recommendation to have the summit register replaced with a digital logging system requiring GPS confirmation before any entry could be recorded. Without much discussion, the same practice in curiosity Christopher had come to recognize over the years as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. He drove into town to speak with a retired mountain guide named Walter Higgins a few days later, a man who had led guided ascents of Iron Cap for over 25 years before retiring, hoping he might have some insight into what he had witnessed. Walter listened to Christopher's account without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he had long suspected rather than learning it fresh. When Christopher finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a name the old guides used for it. Back when I first started leading climbs up that peak," he said. "They called it the early book, the same name folks still use for that register, on account of how it never seemed satisfied waiting for a climber to actually earn their summit before recording it. My theory, for whatever it is worth, is that it does not actually want to hurt anybody directly. It just wants to record a climb a little ahead of schedule, and it will carve whatever name keeps a climber's hand pressed against that rock a little longer, finishing whatever entry it started early." Christopher thought about the faint, discoloring pattern he had watched spread beneath Eric's motionless hand, patient and wrong and utterly convincing given their genuinely dangerous, exposed position. "What happens to the people whose entry it finally finishes writing?" he asked. Walter's expression grew grim. "Nobody rightly knows for certain," he said. "That is the part that scares folks worst, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be." Christopher did not solo climb Iron Cap's technical pitch off-duty again after that conversation, though his work still occasionally required him to inspect the route during routine safety patrols. He found himself developing careful new habits in the months that followed, always checking the summit register against confirmed radio timestamps before trusting any entry fully, and reporting any discrepancy directly to his supervisor rather than simply noting it privately. He started keeping a private notebook too, filled with small, dismissible details from other rangers, reports of similar early entries appearing in summit registers at other technical peaks throughout the district, guides who described feeling reluctant to touch certain pages for reasons they could not quite articulate, climbers who swore a rock face along their route had darkened briefly in a pattern too deliberate to be anything but writing. Eric sent Christopher a brief note weeks later, thanking him formally for the rescue, mentioning almost in passing that he still felt uneasy signing any kind of summit register now, that something about writing his own name down at altitude felt subtly, permanently wrong in a way he could not quite articulate to anyone who had not been there. Christopher read the note twice before filing it away in the same drawer where he kept his private records, understanding completely, without needing Eric to explain further, exactly what he meant. The digital logging system went into effect at Iron Cap's summit within the following season, and the old metal register box was retired to the district storage facility rather than being displayed publicly anywhere. Visitor incidents in the area dropped noticeably in the seasons that followed. But Christopher still hears, occasionally, from other rangers about strange early entries reported during routine reviews of other summit registers throughout the district, always described the same unsettling way, a name and timestamp that predates any climber's actual, confirmed arrival, patient and watchful, waiting for someone to notice their own name already written there and decide, against every reasonable instinct, to keep climbing anyway. If that early entry gave you a chill at altitude, lock it in with a like before you head back down. Tell me in the comments whether you would have kept climbing after seeing your own name already in that book, and subscribe so the next case file reaches you the moment it drops. The warning at Silverhorn Pass. Ranger Mark Delgado had worked the Silverhorn district in the Colorado backcountry for 6 years before he learned that the automated avalanche warning system installed along the pass occasionally sounded an alert for movement that never actually happened. It started with a missing backcountry skier call that came in on a cold, clear February morning, exactly the kind of stable, powder-filled conditions that drew experienced backcountry skiers to Silverhorn Pass despite its well-documented avalanche terrain. A woman named Rachel Ferris, 30 years old, an experienced backcountry skier touring alone after her usual partner had canceled due to a last-minute work obligation, had failed to check in with her emergency contact by her planned return time of 2 that afternoon. Mark pulled the backcountry permit before heading out. Solo skier, extensive avalanche safety training listed, standard rescue equipment confirmed including beacon, probe, and shovel. Nothing in the file suggested anything beyond the ordinary risk of a skier running behind schedule on a longer-than-planned tour. He started up the approach trail on skis a little after 2:30, the automated avalanche warning system's control tower visible on a ridge above him. One of several sensor stations scattered throughout the district's most avalanche-prone terrain, designed to detect actual snow movement and sound a warning siren audible for miles across the open, exposed slopes. Silverhorn Pass had claimed lives before the warning system's installation decades earlier, and the technology had genuinely reduced incidents significantly since. Locals called the pass's most exposed section the False Slide, on account of an old story about how the warning siren occasionally sounded despite the system's own sensors registering absolutely no actual snow movement anywhere in the monitored terrain, and how anyone who fled toward what they believed was safety following that false alarm often found themselves, instead, drawn directly into genuinely unstable terrain the system's own sensors had never actually flagged as dangerous at all. As Mark skinned up the approach, the warning siren suddenly sounded, a long, rising wail that echoed across the open slopes with startling clarity. He stopped immediately, scanning the surrounding terrain for any visible sign of moving snow, and found nothing, the slopes around him sitting exactly as still and undisturbed as they had moments earlier. He radioed dispatch immediately, and the response confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. The automated system's own sensors showed no detected movement anywhere in the monitored zone, and the district's avalanche forecaster had no explanation for why the siren had activated at all. Mark felt an uneasy chill settle over him that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. He continued along the established, low-angle skin track rather than the more exposed terrain the siren's direction seemed to suggest avoiding. And it was as he paused to reorient himself that he noticed the siren's sound shifting subtly, no longer clearly originating from the tower ahead of him, but instead seeming to call from somewhere off to his right, deeper into a section of terrain the district's own hazard maps rated as genuinely, significantly more dangerous than the route he currently followed. His radio crackled with static as he continued, the signal notably weaker than it should have been this close to what was normally one of the district's most reliable repeater locations given the warning tower's own elevated position. He tried reporting his confusion anyway, uncertain whether the message actually carried back to dispatch. Local folklore around this particular pass had always included scattered references to something that had learned, sometime after the warning system's installation, to sound the siren without cause, using the alarm's urgent, unmistakable wail to draw skiers away from established, lower-risk routes and toward genuinely dangerous, unstable terrain instead. Patient enough to let a frightened skier flee directly into real danger while believing themselves to be escaping a false one. He had dismissed these stories the way he dismissed most local folklore, charming color passed down through generations of ski patrol volunteers who simply enjoyed a good scare while briefing backcountry travelers before a tour. Standing here now, listening to an alarm that the system's own sensors insisted had no basis in reality shift direction in a way no simple echo off the surrounding terrain should reasonably produce, that dismissal felt considerably harder to maintain. He continued along the established, lower-angle route rather than following the siren's apparent new direction, refusing to let the alarm pull him toward genuinely hazardous terrain despite its increasingly urgent, insistent wail. And it was perhaps 20 minutes later, the siren having shifted direction several more times throughout his approach, that he heard Rachel's voice calling out from somewhere across the slope, seemingly from the same direction the siren's call currently suggested. "Mark, is that you?" The voice called, thin and disoriented sounding. "I heard the avalanche siren and thought I needed to get off this slope immediately, but now I do not recognize where I ended up." Mark hesitated, remembering the siren's impossible, shifting direction. He called back carefully, keeping his own voice level. "This is Ranger Delgado. Tell me, what avalanche danger rating the forecast listed for today?" There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too smooth, too composed for a genuinely frightened skier who had just fled what she believed was imminent avalanche danger. "I do not remember that right now. I am scared and turn around. Please just come find me instead of asking questions." Mark felt the cold mountain air around him grow suddenly and unnaturally still despite the day's persistent wind, and the siren wailed again, closer now, seemingly originating from almost directly below where he currently stood despite the actual warning tower remaining well behind him at this point, its physical siren far too distant for any sound to carry with such immediate, startling clarity. He stood perfectly still, refusing to move toward the sound in any direction, and the siren wailed once more, patient and deliberate, as though testing whether he might finally give in and ski toward it despite every bit of his own avalanche safety training screaming against the decision. Mark continued along the established route despite every disorienting wail urging him otherwise, and it was nearly 40 minutes later, the skin track finally curving toward a section of terrain he recognized as bordering the pass's most genuinely hazardous slope, that he found Rachel. She stood at the very edge of the established route, close to where it dropped away into steep, heavily loaded terrain the district's hazard maps specifically flagged as extreme risk, motionless, staring down the slope with an expression that made Mark's chest tighten with dread the moment he got close enough to see it clearly through his goggles. Rachel did not turn at the sound of her own name being called. She simply stood there, swaying gently, and Mark noticed with rising horror that the siren, still occasionally wailing somewhere in the distance, always seemed to grow louder and more insistent whenever Rachel's own attention drifted toward that dangerously loaded slope just beyond the established boundary. "Rachel," Mark called out firmly, sidestepping carefully along the safer terrain toward her, keeping his voice as warm and steady as he could manage despite his racing pulse. "Is Ranger Delgado. Your emergency contact has been trying to reach you. Let's get you away from this edge." The woman turned toward the sound slowly, dangerously close to the loaded slope as she shifted her weight on her skis, and for one long, unsettling moment her eyes held the same flat, patient quality Mark had sensed in the siren's impossible, shifting wail, nothing like genuine human fear or confusion. Then something shifted behind her expression, a crack of real recognition breaking through, and she blinked rapidly, swaying on her skis as though waking from a deep and disorienting sleep, stumbling back from the edge before catching her balance against her own poles. "I do not understand," Rachel said, her voice suddenly thin and frightened in a way that finally sounded entirely her own, backing carefully away from the dangerous slope on her own now. "I heard the siren and just started skiing. I do not even remember choosing this direction. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I have no idea how long I've been standing at this edge." Mark moved quickly to guide her back toward the established, safer route, gripping her arm firmly and deliberately positioning himself between her and the loaded slope for the remainder of their careful traverse. As they moved, the siren wailed one final time, distant now, and for the first time all afternoon, It sounded exactly like it should, coming clearly and unmistakably from the tower's actual physical location, while behind them and entirely unconnected to their current position. They made their way back down together, moving quickly but carefully across the stable, established route, and Mark made a deliberate point of keeping Rachel's attention fixed firmly on conversation. Her emergency contact, the drive home, anything that kept her from listening too closely to any further wailing that might still be sounding somewhere in the distance behind them. Rachel's breathing steadied gradually as they descended, and by the time they reached the parking area at the trailhead, she seemed to be returning fully to herself, her earlier confusion replaced by exhausted, shaky relief. "I keep trying to remember what actually happened," Rachel said as she called her emergency contact to let them know she was safe. "I remember hearing the siren, feeling that immediate jolt of fear you're trained to feel. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I was standing right at the edge of that loaded slope with no memory of skiing there." Mark did not press her further, focused instead on making sure she was safely settled and warm before letting her drive home for the evening. It was only once her car had pulled safely out of the parking lot that Mark allowed himself to fully process what he had heard on that pass. Mark filed his official report listing Rachel Ferris as safely recovered after becoming disoriented following an unexplained activation of the avalanche warning siren, citing a probable sensor malfunction as the most likely trigger despite the system's own diagnostics showing no fault anywhere in its equipment. He made no mention of a voice that had worn Rachel's tone like an ill-fitting costume, of a siren that had sounded repeatedly for danger the sensors insisted did not exist, or of how its wailing had grown louder and more insistent, specifically whenever Rachel's attention drifted toward that genuinely, extremely hazardous slope. His supervisor approved the recommendation to install additional physical barriers marking the boundary of the pass's most hazardous terrain without much discussion, the same practiced in Curiosity Mark had come to recognize over the years as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. He drove into town to speak with a retired ski patrol volunteer named Dennis Whitfield a few days later, a man who had monitored Silverhorn Pass's avalanche conditions for over 20 years before retiring, hoping he might have some insight into what he had witnessed. Dennis listened to Mark's account without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he had long suspected rather than learning it fresh. When Mark finished, Dennis was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a name the old patrollers used for it, back when I first started monitoring that pass," he said. "They called it the Fall Slide, the same name folks still use for that section, on account of how it never seemed satisfied warning skiers about actual, genuine danger. My theory, for whatever it is worth, is that it does not actually want to hurt anybody directly. It just wants somebody frightened enough to run blindly, and it will wail from whatever direction leads that person closest to real, waiting danger instead." Mark thought about the siren's disorienting, shifting wail, always growing louder and more insistent near that genuinely hazardous slope, patient and wrong and utterly convincing. What happens to the people who finally follow it all the way onto that loaded terrain, he asked. Dennis's expression grew grim. "Nobody rightly knows for certain," he said. "That is the part that scares folks worst, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be." Mark did not tour that particular section of the pass alone off duty again after that conversation, though his work still occasionally required patrols along that stretch of terrain. He found himself developing careful new habits in the months that followed, always cross-checking any siren activation against the actual sensor data before trusting his own instinct to flee in any particular direction, refusing to let panic alone dictate his route on genuinely avalanche-prone terrain. He started keeping a private notebook too, filled with small, dismissible details from other rangers and ski patrol volunteers, reports of the warning sirens sounding without cause at other sections of the pass, skiers who described feeling drawn toward dangerous terrain by an alert that seemed to be warning them away from it, patrollers who swore the siren had activated on perfectly stable, low avalanche danger days with absolutely no sensor data supporting any activation at all. Rachel sent Mark a brief note weeks later, thanking him formally for the rescue, mentioning almost in passing that she still felt uneasy hearing sirens or alarms of any kind now, that something about an alert calling her toward apparent safety from an unclear direction felt subtly, permanently wrong in a way she could not quite articulate to anyone who had not been there. Mark read the note twice before filing it away in the same drawer where he kept his private records, understanding completely, without needing Rachel to explain further, exactly what she meant. The additional physical barriers went up along the hazardous section's boundary within the month, and the district began requiring backcountry travelers to cross-reference any siren activation against a real-time sensor data feed available through a dedicated mobile app before making any route decisions. Visitor incidents in the area dropped noticeably in the months that followed. But Mark still hears, occasionally from other rangers and ski patrol volunteers, about the warning siren sounding without cause during routine monitoring at other sections of the pass, always described the same unsettling way. An alert that seems to call skiers towards safety from somewhere it should not physically be able to originate, patient and watchful, waiting for someone frightened enough to flee blindly and decide, against every reasonable instinct, to follow it directly toward genuine, waiting danger. If that false alarm had your pulse racing, do not shake it off just yet. Hit like right now before the feeling fades. Drop a comment telling me whether you would have trusted that siren or checked the data first. And subscribe so the next case file reaches you the second it drops. The climber behind at Vulture Point. Ranger Samantha Cole had worked the Vulture Point district in the northern Colorado Rockies for 5 years before she learned that the popular summit photo spot at the peak's true top did not always show only the people who actually stood there. It started with a missing hiker call that came in on a clear August afternoon, exactly the kind of stable, high-visibility day that drew steady traffic to Vulture Point's accessible but genuinely rewarding summit trail, popular enough that the district maintained a dedicated photo marker at the summit itself for visitors to capture their achievement. A woman named Melissa Grant, 26 years old, hiking alone after her friends had turned back partway up the final approach due to fatigue, had failed to meet them at the trailhead parking lot by the agreed-upon time of 6 that evening. Samantha pulled the trail registration before heading out. Solo hiker for the final stretch, experienced with the district trail system, expected return shortly after sunset. Nothing in the file suggested anything beyond the ordinary risk of a hiker losing track of time near a popular, accessible summit. She started up toward the summit a little after 6:30, the popular photo marker visible ahead of her against the darkening sky as she approached the final approach, a simple engraved stone positioned at the exact point offering the district's most photographed panoramic view. Locals called this particular spot the Second Climber, on account of an old story about how photos taken there occasionally showed an additional figure standing behind whoever posed for the shot, always positioned a short distance further back, always slightly out of focus, and how each subsequent photo taken by the same person at that same marker showed the figure standing incrementally closer than the last. Samantha found Melissa's water bottle near the photo marker almost immediately, set down with careful precision on the low stone base, though nothing about its placement suggested any particular urgency or distress. She called out Melissa's name, and the sound moved strangely across the open summit, carrying further than it should have across the still evening air, returning an echo off the surrounding peaks that arrived distorted and layered, as though more than one voice had answered her call. She found Melissa's phone a short distance further along the summit ridge. Its screen cracked, though it still powered on when Samantha checked it. The photo gallery showed a series of summit shots taken throughout the afternoon. Melissa smiling at the popular marker with the panoramic view stretched out behind her. The final several images, though, showed something considerably more unsettling. In each successive photo, a figure had begun appearing in the background, indistinct and slightly blurred at first, positioned near the edge of the frame, well behind where Melissa stood posing. In each subsequent shot, taken only minutes apart according to the timestamps, that same figure appeared noticeably closer, its outline sharpening incrementally with each new image, until the final photograph showed it standing close enough behind Melissa that its shadow, cast by the same afternoon's sun, should have fallen visibly across her own shoulder, though no such shadow appeared anywhere in the frame at all. Samantha felt an uneasy chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. She scanned the summit area carefully, calling Melissa's name at steady intervals, and it was during that search that she found herself, almost without meaning to, raising her own phone toward the popular photo marker, framing a quick shot to document the scene for her eventual report. When she checked the image afterward, a faint, indistinct shape occupied the far edge of the frame, while behind where she herself had been standing, positioned at almost exactly the same distance the figure had first appeared at in Melissa's own earliest altered photograph. Her radio crackled with static as she lowered her phone, the signal notably weaker than it should have been this close to the district's usually reliable repeater coverage at such an exposed, elevated position. She tried reporting her position anyway, uncertain whether the message actually carried back to dispatch. Local folklore around this particular summit marker had always included scattered references to something connected to its exact, specific position. Stories Samantha had heard in fragments over her years working this district, tales about a presence that appeared incrementally in successive photographs taken by the same person at that spot, drawing closer with each new image as though patiently, deliberately closing a distance across time itself rather than physical space, and how anyone who kept photographing themselves there, curious or unnerved enough to document the phenomenon further, eventually took a final photograph showing the figure standing directly behind them, close enough to touch. She had dismissed these stories the way he dismissed most local folklore, charming color passed down through generations of trail crews who simply enjoyed a good scare while maintaining the popular summit marker each season. Standing here now, having just captured her own photograph showing an indistinct figure occupying almost the exact same starting position described in the oldest versions of the story, that dismissal felt considerably harder to maintain. She continued along the summit ridge, deliberately avoiding raising her phone again toward the marker, and it was perhaps 15 minutes later, near a rocky outcropping just below the true summit, where hikers commonly paused to catch their breath during the final approach, that she heard Melissa's voice calling out from somewhere ahead. "Samantha, is that you?" The voice called, thin and disoriented sounding. "I cannot remember how long I have been up here. I think I lost track of time taking photos." Samantha hesitated, remembering the incrementally closer figure in each successive image. She called back carefully, keeping her own voice level. "This is Ranger Cole. Tell me what time your friends turned back on the trail today." There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too smooth, too composed for a genuinely disoriented hiker stranded near a popular, well-marked summit as evening settled over the peak. "I do not remember that right now. I am confused and a little scared. Please just confine me instead of asking questions." Samantha felt the air around her grow suddenly and unnaturally still, and looking back toward the popular photo marker behind her, she noticed with mounting dread that the indistinct shape she had glimpsed in her own photograph now seemed to hover faintly at the very edge of her peripheral vision. Gone the instant she turned to look directly at it, though the unsettling sense of a presence standing just behind her remained. She backed away from the marker entirely, refusing to approach it again, and the peripheral sense of presence seemed to track her retreat, remaining always just at the edge of what she could directly perceive no matter which direction she turned. Samantha continued her search along the summit's rockier, less photographed sections, and it was nearly 30 minutes later, circling back toward the popular marker from its opposite approach, that she finally found Melissa. She stood pressed close against the summit marker itself, her own phone raised in front of her, motionless, staring at its screen with an expression that made Samantha's chest tighten with dread the moment she got close enough to see it clearly. Melissa did not turn at the sound of her own name being called. She simply stood there, swaying gently, and Samantha noticed with rising horror that the phone's camera app remained open, displaying a live preview of the view behind Melissa through the front-facing camera. And in that preview, faintly visible but unmistakably present, stood a shape that no longer required a photograph to become clearly, disturbingly close. "Melissa," Samantha called out firmly, stepping carefully across the summit toward her, keeping her voice as warm and steady as she could manage despite her racing pulse. "It is Ranger Cole. Your friends are waiting at the trailhead. Let us get you away from this marker." The woman turned toward the sound slowly, and for one long, unsettling moment her eyes held the same flat, patient quality Samantha had sensed in the peripheral presence only minutes earlier, nothing like genuine human fear or confusion. Then something shifted behind her expression, a crack of real recognition breaking through, and she blinked rapidly, the phone slipping slightly in her grip, swaying on her feet as though waking from a deep and disorienting sleep. "I do not understand," Melissa said, her voice suddenly thin and frightened in a way that finally sounded entirely her own. "I was just taking a few more photos, trying to get the lighting right. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I have no idea how long I've been standing at this marker." Samantha moved quickly to pull her back from the marker entirely, gripping her arm firmly and guiding her several steps away toward the safer, more open section of the summit. As they turned to make their way back toward the trail, Samantha glanced once more at Melissa's phone screen, still displaying its live camera preview. The shape that had been visible only moments earlier had vanished entirely, showing nothing now but the ordinary, unremarkable panoramic view. They walked back together across the summit, moving quickly but carefully in the deepening dusk, and Samantha made a deliberate point of keeping her own phone tucked away in her jacket for the remainder of their descent, refusing to risk another photograph until they had put real distance between themselves and the popular marker. Melissa's breathing steadied gradually as they descended, and by the time they reached the trailhead where her friends waited anxiously, she seemed to be returning fully to herself, her earlier confusion replaced by exhausted, shaky relief. "I keep trying to remember what actually happened," Melissa said as her friends helped her into their car. "I remember framing the shot, checking my exposure settings. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I could not tell how long I had been standing at that marker." Samantha did not press her further, focused instead on making sure she was safely settled with her friends before they drove off for the evening. It was only once their car had pulled out of the parking lot that Samantha allowed herself to fully process what she had witnessed at that summit. Samantha filed her official report listing Melissa Grant as safely recovered after becoming disoriented while photographing the summit view, citing the disorienting effect of extended photography sessions near a popular, exposed marker as a contributing factor in her confusion. She made no mention of a voice that had worn Melissa's tone like an ill-fitting costume, of a figure that had appeared incrementally closer in successive photographs, or of a live camera preview that had shown something standing directly behind a motionless woman only moments before it vanished entirely. Her supervisor approved the recommendation to relocate the popular photo marker to a different, less isolated section of the summit without much discussion, the same practiced in Curiosity Samantha had come to recognize over the years as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. She drove into town to speak with a retired trail crew supervisor named Gerald Monroe a few days later, a man who had maintained Vulture Point Summit Trail for over 20 years before retiring, hoping he might have some insight into what he had witnessed. Gerald listened to Samantha's account without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he had long suspected rather than learning it fresh. When Samantha finished, Gerald was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a name the old crews used for it back when I first started maintaining that summit," he said. "They called it the Second Climber, the same name folks still use for that marker, on account of how it never seemed satisfied appearing just once in the distance. My theory, for whatever it is worth, is that it does not actually want to hurt anybody directly. It just wants to close a distance a little at a time, and it will hold whatever position keeps someone curious enough to keep photographing that marker again and again, watching it draw closer." Samantha thought about the shape she had glimpsed in her own single photograph, patient and wrong and already closer than she felt entirely comfortable with. What happens to the people who keep photographing that marker long enough for the figure to finally close the distance completely? She asked. Gerald's expression grew grim. "Nobody rightly knows for certain," he said. "That is the part that scares folks worst, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be." Samantha did not photograph herself at the summit marker off-duty again after that conversation, though her work still occasionally required her to inspect the area during routine trail maintenance. She found herself developing careful new habits in the months that followed, always deleting any photo taken near that specific spot immediately after confirming a hiker's safe recovery, refusing to keep even a single image that might show something standing incrementally closer than it should. She started keeping a private notebook too, filled with small, dismissible details from other rangers, reports of similar background figures appearing in photographs taken at other popular summit markers throughout the district, hikers who described feeling watched while posing for photos, trail crews who swore a marker's background view had looked subtly wrong in successive images taken only minutes apart. Melissa sent Samantha a brief note weeks later, thanking her formally for the rescue, mentioning almost in passing that she still felt uneasy taking photos of herself at scenic overlooks now, that something about framing her own image against open, distant terrain felt subtly, permanently wrong in a way she could not quite articulate to anyone who had not been there. Samantha read the note twice before filing it away in the same drawer where she kept her private records, understanding completely, without needing Melissa to explain further, exactly what she meant. The relocated photo marker went into effect within the following month, positioned now in a busier, more heavily trafficked section of the summit where multiple hikers typically gathered at once. Visitor incidents in the area dropped noticeably in the months that followed. But Samantha still hears occasionally from other rangers about strange background figures reported during routine patrols at other popular summit markers throughout the district, always described the same unsettling way, a shape that appears incrementally closer in each successive photograph, taken by the same person, patient and watchful, waiting for someone curious enough to keep photographing that same spot and decide, against every reasonable instinct, to see exactly how close it is, willing to get. If that figure creeping closer photo by photo had you double-checking your own camera roll, hit like right now before you scroll on. Tell me in the comments whether you would have kept taking pictures or put your phone away the second you noticed, and subscribe so the next case file finds you the moment it drops. The guest book at Timberline Shelter. Ranger Brian Whitfield had worked the Timberline District in the Northern Cascades for 6 years before he learned that the backcountry shelter's old guest book occasionally filled itself with entries nobody currently staying there had actually written. It started with a missing climber call that came in on a cold, overcast October evening, exactly the kind of unsettled weather that made experienced mountaineers grateful for the district's high-altitude emergency shelter, a simple but sturdy structure maintained specifically to give stranded climbers somewhere safe to wait out sudden storms. A man named Todd Ellison, 39 years old, an experienced climber attempting a multi-day traverse who had planned to spend the night at Timberline Shelter before continuing his route the following morning, had failed to check in by radio at a scheduled time of 8 that evening. Brian pulled the backcountry permit before heading out. Solo climber, extensive multi-day route experience listed, planned overnight stay at the shelter confirmed in his itinerary. Nothing in the file suggested anything beyond the ordinary risk of a climber losing radio contact due to the shelter's known dead zone. He called Todd's emergency contact, a worried sister named Karen, who explained that Todd had completed similar multi-day traverses throughout the district many times before, always careful about his itinerary and always reliable about checking in whenever conditions allowed. Karen mentioned that Todd's last message, sent from lower on the approach trail earlier that afternoon, had described the weather as looking a little unsettled, but nothing he seemed concerned about given his experience. Brian thanked her, asked her to remain reachable, and started up toward the shelter himself as the snow began falling more steadily around him. He started up toward the shelter a little after 8:30, snow beginning to fall lightly as he climbed, the weather having shifted more quickly than the day's forecast had originally predicted. Timberline Shelter had stood at this exact spot for nearly 50 years, a simple wooden structure with bunks for perhaps 6 climbers and a small wood stove. Its guest book maintained the entire time as a way for the district to track usage and, more practically, to help account for anyone who might go missing along that stretch of the traverse. Locals called the shelter's guest book the forecast book on account of an old story about how on certain stormy nights it filled with entries in the morning that nobody staying there had actually written, entries describing in unsettling detail exactly what weather the following day would bring, along with occasional, far more disturbing notes speculating about which of the current occupants might not survive whatever conditions were coming. Brian reached the shelter a little after 10 that night, snow falling more heavily now, and found the door unlocked but the small structure empty. Todd's pack and sleeping bag laid out neatly on one of the bunks, though Todd himself was nowhere visible inside. He called out Todd's name, and the sound moved strangely within the small, enclosed space, the ordinary acoustics somehow feeling wrong, the echo returning with a faint, delayed quality that made his skin prickle uncomfortably even before he consciously understood why. It was checking the guest book itself, a habit he maintained during every shelter inspection, that he noticed something deeply unsettling. The book lay open to that day's date, Todd's own entry recorded in careful handwriting near the top of the page, noting his route and planned departure time for the following morning. Beneath that entry, in a different, unfamiliar hand, was a second entry, dated to the following day, describing weather conditions that matched nothing in the current forecast, a sudden, severe storm system arriving overnight with high winds and dangerously reduced visibility. Brian felt an uneasy chill settle over him that had nothing to do with the falling snow outside. He examined the second entry more closely, and beneath the weather description, in the same unfamiliar hand, was a final line that made his stomach tighten with genuine dread. Only one of them makes it down. His radio crackled with static as he continued examining the guest book, the signal notably weaker than it should have been, even accounting for the shelter's known dead zone. which normally still allowed at least intermittent contact with dispatch. He tried reporting his position anyway, uncertain whether the message actually carried back. Local folklore around this particular shelter had always included scattered references to its old, weathered guest book, stories Brian had heard in fragments over his years working this district, tales about how the book occasionally recorded weather and survival predictions with disturbing, later confirmed accuracy, written by no one any occupant of the shelter had ever actually witnessed, as though the mountain itself, or something living within it, kept its own careful, patient account of who, among the current guests, would still be alive to see the following sunset. He had dismissed these stories the way he dismissed most local folklore, charming color passed down through generations of shelter maintenance volunteers who simply enjoyed a good scare while restocking firewood each season. He remembered Karen's mention of Todd's own passing, unconcerned observation about the weather looking unsettled, and found himself recalling an old maintenance log entry he had once skimmed describing the shelter's guest book as needing replacement twice within its first decade of use despite otherwise minimal wear, an oddly specific detail that had never made complete sense to him until this exact moment. At the time he had assumed it was simply routine wear from decades of heavy backcountry use. Standing here now, holding a book containing an impossible, unsettling prediction, he found himself wondering whether that early, unexplained replacement had actually been driven by something considerably less mundane than ordinary wear. Standing here now, holding a book containing a genuine weather prediction that, checking his own updated forecast on his radio, was already beginning to prove disturbingly accurate as the snowfall outside intensified faster than any official model had called for. That dismissal felt considerably harder to maintain. He stepped back outside into the worsening snow, calling Todd's name at steady intervals, and it was perhaps 15 minutes later, near a rocky outcropping a short distance from the shelter, where climbers sometimes paused to check their bearings, that he heard Todd's voice calling out from somewhere in the swirling snow ahead of him. "Brian, is that you?" The voice called, thin and disoriented sounding. "I stepped out to check the weather, and now I cannot find my way back to the shelter. Everything looks the same in this snow." Brian hesitated, remembering the impossible entry and its unsettling final line. He called back carefully, keeping his own voice level. "This is Ranger Whitfield. Tell me what route you were planning to continue on tomorrow morning." There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too smooth, too composed for a genuinely lost and frightened climber stranded somewhere near shelter in worsening, dangerous conditions. "I do not remember that right now. I am cold and confused. Please just come find me instead of asking questions." Brian felt the falling snow around him thicken suddenly and unnaturally, visibility dropping to almost nothing within the space of a few seconds despite the storm's actual official intensity still building gradually according to his radio's weather updates. Through the thickening snow, he thought he glimpsed, just for a moment, the pale shape of the shelter itself, though positioned in a direction that made no sense relative to where he knew he had actually walked from it. He stood perfectly still, refusing to move toward either the voice or the impossible glimpse of shelter, and the snow around him swirled thicker still, patient and deliberate, as though testing whether disorientation alone might finally convince him to wander somewhere genuinely dangerous. Brian pulled out a length of rope from his emergency kit and anchored one insecurely to a fixed point near where he stood, playing out the line carefully as he continued searching in a controlled, systematic pattern rather than risking further disorientation. And it was nearly 20 minutes later, the rope nearly fully extended, that he finally found Todd. He stood at the edge of a genuinely dangerous drop-off, one that Brian knew, from experience, sat considerably further from the shelter than any climber should have wandered while simply checking the weather, motionless, staring out into the swirling snow with an expression that made Brian's chest tighten with dread the moment he got close enough to see it clearly through the storm. Todd did not turn at the sound of his own name being called. He simply stood there, swaying gently, dangerously close to the unmarked edge. "Todd," Brian called out firmly, closing the remaining distance carefully, keeping his voice as warm and steady as he could manage despite his racing pulse and the genuine danger of their current position. "It is Ranger Whitfield. The shelter is back this way. Let's get you away from this edge." The man turned toward the sound slowly, dangerously close to the drop as he shifted his weight, and for one long, unsettling moment his eyes held the same flat, patient quality Brian had sensed in the swirling, unnatural snow only minutes earlier. Nothing like genuine human fear or confusion. Then something shifted behind his expression, a crack of real recognition breaking through, and he blinked rapidly, stumbling back from the edge as though only just now noticing exactly how close he stood to it, swaying on his feet as though waking from a deep and disorienting sleep. "I do not understand," Todd said, his voice suddenly thin and frightened in a way that finally sounded entirely his own, backing carefully away from the drop on his own now. "I just stepped outside to check the sky. I swear I was only gone a couple minutes." Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I have no idea how long I've been standing out here, or how close I was to that edge. Brian moved quickly to guide him back toward the shelter, keeping a firm grip on his arm and following his own anchored rope line carefully back through the worsening snow. As they walked, the storm's intensity, oddly, began settling back toward something closer to the actual, official forecast rather than whatever unnatural severity had briefly gripped the area around them only minutes earlier. They reached the shelter together, and Brian immediately got the small wood stove burning properly, checking Todd carefully for any sign of hypothermia after his extended, unexplained time standing exposed near that dangerous edge. Todd's breathing steadied gradually as the shelter warmed, and within the hour he seemed to be returning fully to himself, his earlier confusion replaced by exhausted, shaky relief. "I keep trying to remember what actually happened," Todd said as he warmed his hands near the stove. "I remember stepping outside, checking the cloud cover, thinking the storm looked worse than expected. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice calling my name and me realizing I was standing right at the edge of a drop I had no memory of walking toward." Brian did not press him further, focused instead on making sure he was warm and stable through the remainder of the night before their planned descent the following morning once conditions improved. It was only once Todd had settled into his sleeping bag, apparently asleep, that Brian allowed himself to check the guest book one final time. The impossible entry remained exactly as he had first found it, the unsettling weather prediction and its final, ominous line still visible in that same, unfamiliar hand. Brian closed the book carefully and did not open it again for the remainder of the night. Brian filed his official report listing Todd Ellison as safely recovered after becoming disoriented in sudden, severe whiteout conditions near the shelter, citing rapidly deteriorating weather as the primary contributing factor in his confusion. He made no mention of a voice that had worn Todd's tone like an ill-fitting costume, of a guest book entry that had predicted the storm's severity with disturbing accuracy before it actually developed, or of its unsettling final line, suggesting only one of them would make it down safely. His supervisor approved the recommendation to replace the shelter's physical guest book with a digital check-in system requiring satellite confirmation. Without much discussion, the same practice and curiosity Brian had come to recognize over the years as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. He drove into town to speak with a retired shelter maintenance volunteer named Harold Bennett a few days later, a man who had serviced Timberline Shelter for over 20 years before retiring, hoping he might have some insight into what he had witnessed. Harold listened to Brian's account without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he had long suspected rather than learning it fresh. When Brian finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a name the old volunteers used for it. Back when I first started servicing that shelter," he said. "They called it the Forecast Book, the same name folks still use for it, on account of how it never seemed satisfied with ordinary weather predictions alone. My theory, for whatever it is worth, is that it does not actually want to hurt anybody directly. It just wants to keep an accurate account of who does not make it down, and it will lure whoever it has already decided about a little closer to genuine danger, close enough to make its own prediction come true." Brian thought about the impossible entry's final, ominous line, patient and wrong and disturbingly close to proving accurate that very night. What happens to the people whose survival it has already decided against, he asked. Harold's expression grew grim. "Nobody rightly knows for certain," he said. "That is the part that scares folks worst, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be." He mentioned, after a long pause, that he had personally torn out and burned at least 2 similar entries over his years servicing that shelter, never reporting the discovery to anyone officially, since he had never trusted himself to explain the decision convincingly to the district office. Brian asked him, carefully, whether he had ever personally read a prediction about himself in that book. Harold was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes drifting toward the window as though picturing the old wooden shelter rather than the room they currently sat in. Once he finally said, "Early in my very first season maintaining that shelter, during a storm I nearly did not walk away from. I have never told anyone what that entry actually said about me specifically, and I do not intend to start now. Only that I understood afterward exactly why I made it down and somebody else that same week did not." Brian did not check that guest book alone during his storm off duty again after that conversation, though his work still occasionally required him to inspect the shelter during routine patrols. He found himself developing careful new habits in the months that followed, always checking the book during calm, clear weather rather than active storms, and reporting any unfamiliar entry directly to his supervisor rather than simply noting it privately. He started keeping a private notebook too, filled with small, dismissible details from other rangers, reports of similar unexplained entries appearing in guest books at other backcountry shelters throughout the district, climbers who described feeling reluctant to check the book during bad weather for reasons they could not quite articulate. Maintenance volunteers who swore a shelter's book had predicted a storm's severity with unsettling accuracy hours before any official forecast update. Confirmed it. Todd sent Brian a brief note weeks later, thanking him formally for the rescue, mentioning almost in passing that he still felt uneasy staying in backcountry shelters now, that something about reading a guest book's previous entries felt subtly, permanently wrong in a way he could not quite articulate to anyone who had not been there. He added that he had also started carrying a satellite messenger on every subsequent trip, unwilling to rely on any shelter's own records for confirmation of his safety, no matter how remote the route required him to travel. Brian read the note twice before filing it away in the same drawer where he kept his private records, understanding completely, without needing Todd to explain further, exactly what he meant. The digital check-in system went into effect at Timberline Shelter within the following season, requiring satellite confirmation and a photograph of each occupant's actual physical presence before any entry could be logged, and the old physical guest book was retired to the district storage facility rather than being displayed publicly anywhere. Visitor incidents in the area dropped noticeably in the seasons that followed, but Brian still hears, occasionally, from other rangers about strange entries reported during routine inspections at other backcountry shelter guestbooks throughout the district always describe the same unsettling way. A weather prediction written in an unfamiliar hand that proves disturbingly accurate, sometimes followed by a brief, unsettling note about who among the current occupants will not survive, patient and watchful, waiting for someone curious enough to read it during the very storm it is already decided to describe. If that guestbook's final line sent a chill through you, hit like right now before you put this one down. Tell me in the comments whether you would have kept reading that book or closed it immediately. And subscribe so the next case file finds you the moment it drops. The cold pitch on Ravenspire Wall. Ranger Alicia Ferreira had worked the Ravenspire district in the North Cascade for 5 years before she learned that a certain pitch on the district's most technically demanding climbing route occasionally made a climber's own gear turn cold, as though someone else had already been using it moments before. It started with a missing climber call that came in on a warm July afternoon. Exactly the kind of stable, low-wind conditions that drew serious technical climbers to attempt Ravenspire's namesake wall, a route respected throughout the region for its sustained difficulty and genuinely committing position. A man named Nathan Cross, 31 years old, an experienced technical climber attempting the route with his usual partner, had reached the crux pitch, a notoriously difficult section roughly 2/3 of the way up the wall, when his partner, belaying from a hanging stance below, radioed up that Nathan had gone completely silent and unresponsive despite still being visibly, physically present on the rock. Alicia pulled the climbing permit before heading out. Two-person team, both experienced with sustained technical routes, standard rack and protection confirmed at the base. Nothing in the file suggested anything beyond the ordinary risk of a climber freezing up mentally on a genuinely difficult, exposed section. She arrived at the base of the wall a little after 2 that afternoon. Nathan's climbing partner, a shaken young woman named Vanessa, already anchored securely and waiting anxiously, the rope still running up to where Nathan remained motionless on the crux pitch above. Ravenspire's namesake wall had drawn serious climbers for decades. Its crux pitch considered one of the more technically demanding sections in the entire district's climbing terrain. Locals called that specific pitch the cold hand, on account of an old story about how climbers reaching that section sometimes found their own carabiners and protection gear turning noticeably, unnaturally cold in their hands, as though someone else had been gripping the same equipment only moments before, using it to place protection the current climber had not actually placed themselves. Alicia examined Vanessa's belay setup carefully, confirming the anchor and belay device both functioned correctly, and looked up toward the crux pitch, where Nathan remained motionless, clearly visible but unresponsive to repeated calls from below. "Nathan," Alicia called out loudly, cupping her hands around her mouth to carry the sound up the exposed rock face. "This is Ranger Ferreira. I need you to respond if you can hear me." No response came from the pitch above, though Nathan's posture shifted slightly, enough to confirm he remained conscious and physically capable of movement, his attention seemingly fixed on something Alicia could not see from this angle at the base of the wall. Alicia felt an uneasy chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the day's warm temperature. She began her own ascent alongside a second, more experienced climbing ranger who had responded to the call, both of them moving quickly but carefully up the established route toward the crux pitch where Nathan waited. Her radio crackled with static as she climbed, the signal notably weaker than it should have been this close to the district's usually reliable repeater coverage along this popular, well-monitored route. She tried reporting her position anyway, uncertain whether the message actually carried back to dispatch. Local folklore around this particular wall had always included scattered references to something connected to the crux pitch specifically, stories Alicia had heard in fragments over her years working this district, tales about a presence that had learned, over decades of climbers attempting that same difficult section, to make a climber's own protection gear turn cold and unfamiliar in their grip, convincing them, gradually and patiently, that someone else was already climbing alongside them, placing gear ahead of their own actual progress, until eventually that climber stopped trusting their own placements entirely and simply froze, waiting for a partner who existed nowhere except in the deliberate, cold illusion pressed into their own hands. He had dismissed these stories the way he dismissed most local folklore, charming color passed down through generations of climbing guides who simply enjoyed a good scare while briefing clients before a demanding technical ascent. Standing partway up the route now, having just watched Nathan remain fixed and unresponsive on a pitch where the old stories always warned climbers specifically to stay alert, that dismissal felt considerably harder to maintain. She and the second ranger continued their ascent carefully, and it was perhaps 15 minutes later, reaching a point just below the crux pitch itself, that Alicia heard Nathan's voice carry down clearly from above, his tone strange in a way that made her stomach tighten before she had even fully processed the words. "Alicia, is that you?" The voice called, thin and disoriented, sounding despite its unusual clarity across the open rock face. "Someone already placed the next piece for me. I can feel it right here, cold in my hand, but I do not remember placing it myself." Alicia hesitated, remembering Vanessa's own account of Nathan's sudden silence only an hour earlier. She called back carefully, keeping her own voice level. "This is Ranger Ferreira. Tell me Vanessa's last name, and tell me what color helmet she is wearing today." There was a pause, longer than felt natural, before the voice answered again, its rhythm subtly shifting into something too smooth, too composed for a genuinely confused climber perched on a difficult, exposed pitch hundreds of feet above solid ground. "I do not need to answer that right now," Nathan said, his voice carrying an odd, patient quality that had nothing to do with genuine climbing focus. "Everything feels completely secure up here. I think I might just keep climbing on my own from this point, following what has already been placed ahead of me." Alicia felt the rock face around her grow suddenly and unnaturally still, the day's light breeze falling silent all at once. And above her, she watched Nathan's free hand reach toward a section of rock that, from her current angle, showed no visible protection placed at all, despite his fingers closing around something clearly solid enough to grip. She climbed faster, refusing to let the strange stillness slow her pace, and it was only a few minutes later that she and the second ranger finally reached the pitch where Nathan waited, close enough now to see clearly the flat, distant quality in Nathan's expression as he stared at his own hand, gripping empty air with a confidence that made no physical sense at all. "Nathan," Alicia said firmly, moving carefully onto a stance beside him and gripping his shoulder with a firm, grounding pressure. "It is Ranger Ferreira. I need you to look at me right now, and I need you to check that your actual protection is properly placed before we go any further." Nathan turned toward her slowly, and for one long, unsettling moment his eyes held the same flat, patient quality Alicia had sensed in the rock's impossible stillness only moments earlier, nothing like genuine climber's focus or confidence. Then something shifted behind his expression, a crack of real recognition breaking through, and he blinked rapidly, his hand jerking back from the empty air as though only just now noticing it was gripping nothing at all. "I do not understand," Nathan said, his voice suddenly thin and frightened in a way that finally sounded entirely his own, scrambling immediately to check his actual place protection with shaking hands. I felt a carabiner right there, cold, solid, like someone had just clipped it in ahead of me. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice, and me realizing there's nothing actually placed where I thought I felt it. Alicia kept a firm grip on him while he secured proper protection, checking every placement twice before allowing either of them to relax, even slightly. Once she confirmed Nathan was genuinely, physically secure, She radioed down to Vanessa, confirming the recovery and requesting she maintain steady, deliberate tension on the actual rope for the remainder of their careful descent. "We are heading down together," Alicia told Nathan firmly. "Keep your eyes on your own gear and on what your hands can actually see themselves placing. Do not trust anything that feels secure without a visual confirmation to match it." Nathan nodded shakily, his breathing coming in quick, uneven gasps as Alicia guided him through the careful process of rappelling back down toward the base, refusing to let his own attention drift toward anything beyond the immediate, physical mechanics of the descent itself. "I keep trying to remember what actually happened," Nathan said once they finally reached solid ground, his legs nearly buckling beneath him as Vanessa rushed forward to help steady him. "I remember starting the crux moves, feeling good about my sequence. Then there is this gap, and the next clear thing I remember is your voice telling me to look at my own gear instead of wherever I was looking before." Alicia did not press him further, focused instead on getting him checked over and safely off the wall entirely for the day. It was only once Nathan had been safely reunited with Vanessa and both climbers were on their way to the parking area that Alicia allowed herself to fully process what she had witnessed on that pitch. Alicia filed her official report listing Nathan Cross as safely recovered following a communication breakdown between climbing partners during a difficult technical section, citing possible temporary mental fatigue as the most likely explanation despite knowing full well that Vanessa's own belay technique had shown no error at any point during the incident. She made no mention of a voice that had grown too smooth and composed for genuine climbing focus, of a hand that had gripped empty air with complete, unshakable confidence, or of Nathan's own insistence that protection already existed somewhere it clearly did not. Her supervisor approved the recommendation to install additional signage at the base of the crux pitch, specifically reminding climbers to visually confirm every placement before trusting it. Without much discussion, the same practice and curiosity Alicia had come to recognize over the years as a survival mechanism baked into how this particular district handled things nobody wanted to examine too closely. She drove into town to speak with a retired climbing guide named Frank Alvarez a few days later, a man who had led guided ascents of Ravenspire's namesake wall for over 20 years before retiring, hoping he might have some insight into what he had witnessed. Frank listened to Alicia's account without interrupting, nodding slowly at certain details as though confirming something he had long suspected rather than learning it fresh. When Alicia finished, Frank was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "There's a name the old guides used for it, back when I first started leading climbs up that wall," he said. "They called it the cold hand, the same name folks still use for that pitch, on account of how it never seemed satisfied letting a climber trust their own placements alone. My theory, for whatever it is worth, is that it does not actually want to hurt anybody directly. It just wants to feel like it is climbing alongside someone for a little while, and it will make whatever gear feels cold and solid enough to convince a climber they are not actually placing protection on their own." Alicia thought about the empty air Nathan had gripped so confidently, patient and wrong and utterly convincing in its coldness. What happens to the people who finally trust that phantom placement completely? She asked. Frank's expression grew grim. "Nobody rightly knows for certain," he said. "That is the part that scares folks worst, I think. Not knowing is worse than any answer could be." Alicia did not climb past that particular pitch off duty again after that conversation, though her work still occasionally required her to inspect the route during routine safety patrols. She found herself developing careful new habits in the months that followed, always visually confirming every piece of protection twice before trusting any sense of security, refusing to rely on feel alone, no matter how convincing or reassuring it seemed. She started keeping a private notebook too, filled with small, dismissible details from other rangers and climbing guides, Reports of climbers describing unexplained cold sensations in their own gear at other technically demanding pitches throughout the district, partners who swore they had watched a climber's hand close around something that clearly was not there, guides who noted, without much comment, how many near-miss incidents on that particular pitch had occurred at almost exactly the same difficult section. Nathan sent Alicia a brief note weeks later, thanking him formally for the rescue, mentioning almost in passing that he still felt uneasy trusting the feel of his own gear alone now, that something about placing protection without looking felt subtly, permanently wrong in a way he could not quite articulate to anyone who had not been there. Alicia read the note twice before filing it away in the same drawer where she kept her private records, understanding completely, without needing Nathan to explain further, exactly what he meant. The additional signage went up at the base of the crux pitch within the month, and the district began recommending climbing parties conduct a verbal safety check confirming every placement visually rather than by feel alone, regardless of how experienced either partner happened to be. Visitor incidents in the area dropped noticeably in the months that followed. But Alicia still hears, occasionally, from other rangers and climbing guides about strange, unexplained cold sensations reported during routine patrols at other technically demanding pitches throughout the district, always described the same unsettling way, a piece of gear that feels solid and secure and cold enough to convince a climber someone else has already placed it, patient and watchful, waiting for someone tired enough to trust it a little more completely than their own two hands actually deserve. If that cold carabiner sent a chill through your own hands, hit like right now before you climb on to something else. Tell me in the comments whether you would have trusted that phantom placement or checked it twice like Nathan should have. And subscribe so the next case file catches you right when it drops.